Hello there, and welcome back to Cosmic Whispers. Wherever you find yourself at this moment, perhaps on a quiet evening walk, or in the comfortable stillness of your home, let's ponder something together. What if the story of humanity, the grand narrative we've been taught since childhood, isn't the original manuscript? What if it's merely the latest edition, a reprint of a tale whose earlier volumes have been lost to the unforgiving currents of time? Imagine for a moment that entire worlds, entire epochs of civilization might have blossomed and then withered long before the first words of our recorded history were ever etched into stone. Could societies, perhaps even more sophisticated than our own, have risen to unimaginable heights only to be scoured from the surface of the earth, leaving behind only the faintest of whispers? If our planet has indeed hosted more than one cycle of intelligent life, how much of what we call the past is a genuine beginning, and how much is simply a reconstruction built upon the forgotten ruins of what came before? Let's quietly explore this unsettling, yet deeply fascinating idea, the possibility of a reset past. Most of us are raised with a very specific model of history. It is presented as a singular, unbroken ascent, a great, linear staircase stretching from a primitive past into our complex present. We picture this journey as a timeline in a textbook. It begins with early hominids huddled around a fire, moves methodically through the discovery of agriculture, the birth of cities, the rise and fall of empires, the spark of industry, and culminates, inevitably, in our own technologically saturated world. It is a clean, logical progression. It's a story of steady advancement, a comforting narrative of humanity's slow but certain climb from the darkness of ignorance into the light of knowledge, from chipped stone tools to the glowing screens of smartphones. But what if this beautifully linear story is a profound oversimplification? What if the past is not a single, straight line at all, but rather a collection of lines, a series of distinct narratives, each one reaching its own climax before ending abruptly, forcing the next to begin again from a state of near amnesia? The notion that history might have been reset, not just once, but perhaps multiple times, strikes many as fantastical, an idea better suited for fiction than for serious consideration. Yet, when we pause to reflect, a critical truth emerges. Our entire understanding of the past is constructed from the fragile remnants that have managed to survive. We are historical detectives, piecing together a grand narrative from circumstantial evidence, shards of pottery, the foundations of buried buildings, fragments of written text that have miraculously escaped the ravages of time. And herein lies the fundamental problem. The overwhelming majority of things created by human hands are ephemeral. Steel, the very backbone of our modern world, inevitably surrenders to rust. Concrete, our symbol of permanence, crumbles under the relentless pressure of wind and water. Even our accumulated knowledge, stored in books and on servers, is profoundly vulnerable. Paper turns to dust, and digital data is a fragile ghost that requires constant energy and maintenance to exist. If a civilization were simply left to the elements, abandoned for a mere few thousand years, nature's reclamation would be near total. Forests would swallow cities, and oceans would grind monuments into sand. Now, let your imagination take a step further. Envision a civilization as advanced as our own, or perhaps one that surpassed us in ways we cannot yet conceive, existing in the deep past. Picture their sprawling metropolises, their intricate networks of communication, their profound understanding of science. Then, imagine a cataclysm. It would not require an asteroid impact of cinematic proportions. A series of massive volcanic eruptions clouding the sky, a sudden and severe shift in the global climate, or a devastating pandemic could be enough to shatter the delicate systems that sustain a complex society. In the ensuing chaos, knowledge would be lost, technologies forgotten, and the population scattered. 1,000 years later, what would remain? Perhaps a few enigmatic structures buried deep beneath layers of earth and sediment. Perhaps a handful of exquisitely crafted artifacts, their original purpose obscured by time, dismissed by future archaeologists as ritual objects or curious anomalies. Without the context, without the library of knowledge that gave them meaning, we would not recognize them for what they truly were. This concept is not entirely confined to speculative fiction. Within our own recorded history, we have witnessed chilling examples of civilization's fragility. The Roman city of Pompeii, a bustling hub of commerce and culture, was frozen in time and effectively erased in a single afternoon by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. The Great Library of Alexandria, a legendary repository said to contain the collective knowledge of the ancient world, was lost to fire and conflict. Countless scrolls works of philosophy, science, history, and art vanished forever, leaving an unfillable void in our understanding of antiquity. These were, in the grand scheme of things, localized events. Imagine a catastrophe on a planetary scale. The erasure would be almost absolute. If such resets have indeed occurred, it implies that the human story is vastly older, stranger, and more intricate than the simple timeline we are taught. It suggests that we are living on a planet of ghosts, our world built upon layers and layers of forgotten civilizations. Each of these lost worlds would have possessed its own languages, its own technologies, its own unique cultures and philosophies, all of it now lost to the great silence of time. Some of these preceding cultures might have achieved feats we have yet to replicate. Others might have developed along entirely different technological or philosophical paths, creating societies built on principles and materials that leave no recognizable traces for our modern methods to detect. Consider for a moment the precarious nature of our own repository of knowledge. The vast majority of humanity's information today exists in a digital format, stored on servers, hard drives, and the ephemeral cloud. If a global event, a massive solar flare, for instance, were to destroy our electronic infrastructure, that knowledge would vanish in an instant. Our paper records would last a little longer, but exposed to the elements, they too would decay into nothingness within a few centuries. A society collapsing under such circumstances would suffer a catastrophic intellectual death. Future generations, if they survived, might know almost nothing of the 21st century. They might find the scattered remains of our cities and wonder at the strange, crumbling towers and rusted metal husks, perhaps weaving myths about the giants who built them. This is precisely what makes the reset hypothesis so profoundly unsettling. It reframes our position in history. We are not the pinnacle of a long, unbroken climb. We may simply be the latest iteration in a long cycle of ascent and collapse. Each time, humanity, or perhaps a form of intelligent life that preceded us, has been forced to rebuild, creating a new history, tragically unaware that it was not starting from a blank slate. As you begin to view the past through this lens, certain puzzles in our accepted history become far more difficult to dismiss. We see sudden, inexplicable leaps in human progress that seem to defy the slow pace of gradual development. We encounter ancient myths from disparate cultures that speak with haunting similarity of world-ending floods, of fires falling from the sky, and of godlike figures who descended to teach the survivors the arts of civilization. And we find those scattered archaeological discoveries, artifacts that seem technologically out of place for their era, which are so often categorized as hoaxes, misinterpretations, or inconvenient outliers. If resets are a reality, perhaps these are not outliers at all. Perhaps they are the faint, lingering echoes of the worlds that came before. This exploration is not about embracing every fringe theory or uncritically accepting every unsubstantiated claim. It is about fostering a sense of intellectual humility. It is about acknowledging the vastness of our ignorance. The further we journey back in time, the sparser and more ambiguous the evidence becomes. We are like archaeologists attempting to reconstruct an epic novel from a handful of charred, torn pages found scattered in the ashes. We dutifully fill in the enormous gaps with our best educated guesses, with what seems logical to us based on the little we have. But our logical reconstruction is not the same as the original story. If history has been reset, it fundamentally alters our perception of ourselves. We are not the inevitable, final product of evolution and progress. We may not even be the most advanced or wisest beings to have ever called this planet home. We are simply the current chapter in a vast, cyclical saga. This realization implies that everything we have constructed, our towering skyscrapers, our global communication networks, our deepest scientific insights, is transient. It could all be swept away, and one day, in a distant future, a new people or something else entirely might rebuild their world upon our dust, never knowing we were here. This possibility is at once humbling and deeply disturbing. It compels us to question the neat, sanitized version of history we've been handed, and opens the door to a much stranger, more profound, and more mysterious vision of the past, one where great civilizations can vanish almost without a trace, and where the story of this world has been written, erased, and rewritten, time and time again. The idea of a reset past is not just a mystery about what came before us. It is also a quiet, persistent warning about what could lie ahead. For if it has happened before, there is no reason to believe it cannot happen again. When you pause to examine the conventional telling of history, particularly as it's presented in our formative years, a certain tidiness becomes apparent. It has a polished, almost curated structure. We begin in the Paleolithic era, with early humans as hunter-gatherers, their lives dictated by the seasons and the migration of animals. Then, like a precisely scheduled event, the Neolithic Revolution arrives around 10,000 BCE. Farming is discovered, villages sprout from the earth, and these settlements grow into the first cities. From there, the narrative marches forward with an almost metronomic regularity. Empires rise, technologies are invented, philosophies are born, and progress continues its steady, upward climb until it arrives at our doorstep. The story feels logical, sequential, and in a way, deeply satisfying. But the more you contemplate this narrative, the more it begins to feel suspiciously clean, as if a complex and chaotic reality has been meticulously organized for the sake of a clear presentation. Real life, as we experience it, seldom moves in such a straight line. The path of progress in the actual world is messy, fraught with missteps, long periods of stagnation, and startling dead ends. Entire civilizations can and do collapse. Revolutionary discoveries are made, and then, tragically, forgotten. Entire ways of life can vanish in the space of a single generation. Yet our official historical timeline often presents the past as a smooth, linear ascent, largely devoid of the colossal gaps, unexplained leaps, and profound regressions that likely characterized it. This inherent neatness should prompt us to ask a crucial question. Are we looking at the full, unedited picture, or are we being shown the most convenient and easily digestible version of the story? One of the primary reasons the timeline appears so orderly is that it is an architecture built upon a foundation of profoundly limited evidence. For the vast majority of human existence, we have next to nothing. We are told, for example, that agriculture was invented approximately 12,000 years ago. But this date is not a definitive statement of fact. It is simply based on the oldest evidence for systematic farming that we have found so far. Is it not conceivable that the principles of agriculture were discovered, practiced, and then lost in a previous cycle, thousands of years before the period we have identified? We would likely never know. Archaeology can be likened to finding a few random pieces of a million-piece jigsaw puzzle scattered across a table the size of a continent, with most of the tables still shrouded in darkness. We connect the pieces we have in the way that makes the most sense, but we have no way of knowing how much of the true image remains missing. Another layer of simplification arises from the fact that history has always been written and rewritten, not necessarily as part of a grand conspiracy, but as a matter of practical necessity and cultural bias. Throughout the ages, records have been destroyed in wars, consumed by fires, or simply allowed to decay. What survives is often the story told by the victors, a narrative shaped to legitimize their power. The further back in time we attempt to look, the more this problem intensifies, and the more uncertain everything becomes. Historians must bridge these enormous gaps with educated speculation. Over time, as these speculations are repeated in journals and textbooks, they gradually harden, taking on the weight and authority of established facts. Even when new discoveries emerge that should compel us to reconsider them. There is also the pervasive issue of our modern assumptions about progress. We instinctively believe that knowledge is cumulative, that humanity's intellectual toolkit only ever grows larger. But history itself provides stark counterexamples. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD precipitated a period in Europe often referred to as the Dark Ages. During this time, a great deal of sophisticated knowledge that had been commonplace for centuries was effectively lost. Advanced techniques for making concrete, complex aqueduct systems, central heating, and even certain medical practices largely vanished from the collective skill set of European societies for hundreds of years. If such a significant technological and cultural regression can occur within our relatively well-documented history, it is not difficult to imagine far more catastrophic collapses happening in the deeper unrecorded past, events that could have wiped the slate of knowledge almost entirely clean. This leads to a subtle but crucial point of language. When archaeologists unearth the ruins of a 5,000-year-old city, we often see it described as one of the earliest known examples of urban living. But earliest known is not synonymous with the first that ever existed. It simply means it's the oldest one we have discovered to date. Considering the vast expanses of the earth that remain unexcavated, buried beneath dense jungles, shifting deserts, and the immense pressure of our oceans, it is entirely plausible, if not probable, that far older and perhaps more advanced civilizations once flourished and are now utterly lost to us. Even the scientific dating methods we rely on, such as radiocarbon dating, have their limitations and are subject to interpretation. Contamination of samples or incorrect assumptions about the geological context of a find can produce results that are misleading or incomplete. If the remains of a previous civilization were violently scattered by a cataclysm, the fragments we find might not accurately reflect the true age or sophistication of the world they came from. This overly neat version of history also struggles to accommodate anomalies, those inconvenient findings that refuse to fit into the established story. Out-of-place artifacts, monumental structures that defy the supposed technological capabilities of their builders, and ancient myths that describe seemingly modern concepts are often brushed aside as hoaxes, errors in dating, or simple coincidences. But what if they are not? If the past has been subjected to periodic resets, these anomalies might not be mistakes in our understanding. They could be the legitimate leftover fragments, the cultural debris of those earlier worlds, stubbornly persisting into our own time. A further clue that our timeline may be a simplified sketch is the astonishing speed with which certain great civilizations appear in the archaeological record. Consider ancient Egypt. According to the mainstream narrative, Egyptian civilization seems to spring into existence around 3000 BCE, but it does so almost fully formed. Complex hierarchical society, monumental architecture, a sophisticated writing system, and profound artistic traditions seem to emerge with breathtaking rapidity. How did a society transition from what is assumed to be a collection of simple, scattered agricultural settlements to building the Great Pyramids in such a historically short period? The standard explanation involves a rapid, localized development. But the reset hypothesis offers an alternative. Perhaps they did not start from scratch at all. Perhaps they were the inheritors of a body of knowledge, a legacy of wisdom passed down from a now vanished predecessor. Ultimately, the neatness of history may stem as much from our own psychology as it does from the evidence. As human beings, we are pattern-seeking storytellers. We crave narratives with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. We want history to make sense, to follow a logical and predictable course. To admit that the past might be a chaotic tapestry of forgotten triumphs, cataclysmic failures, and vast, unknowable voids is to accept a level of uncertainty that many find uncomfortable. It is far easier, far more reassuring, to embrace a timeline that appears orderly, even if that order is an illusion born of incomplete data. This is not to suggest that historians and archaeologists are engaged in deliberate deception. They are dedicated scholars working diligently with the information available to them. But the truth may be that we are all building our grand edifice of historical understanding on the edge of an enormous uncharted chasm, a gap in time where entire worlds could have existed, been erased, and left almost no trace. If history has been reset, then the official timeline we are taught is less the complete story and more the current edition. It is like reading the final book in a long series, unaware that all the preceding volumes have been lost to a great fire. The more you examine history with this possibility in your mind, the more you begin to notice the strange rhythms and patterns, the civilizations that burst forth as if from nowhere, the ancient knowledge that mysteriously vanishes only to reappear centuries later, and the temporal gaps that seem too vast to be mere coincidence. The official timeline feels neat because it is a narrative constructed for clarity, not for complexity. But the real past, if it contains these cycles of destruction and rebirth, would be infinitely messier, profoundly stranger, and far, far older than we have ever dared to imagine. Throughout the annals of human exploration, we have continually stumbled upon the ghostly footprints of societies that appeared, flourished with breathtaking brilliance, and then vanished, often leaving behind more questions than answers. These lost civilizations are like phantom chapters in the epic of humanity. We can see tantalizing glimpses of their achievements in the ruins they left behind, but the core of their story, how they lived, what they believed, and the precise reasons for their demise, is often shrouded in an impenetrable mist. The deeper we dig, both literally and figuratively, the more we find that these mysterious disappearances may not be isolated incidents. They could, instead, be evidence of a recurring cycle, a planetary rhythm where worlds rise, fall, and are ultimately forgotten. Perhaps one of the most compelling examples is the Indus Valley Civilization, which thrived over 4,000 years ago in what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India. This was one of the world's first great urban cultures, contemporaneous with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Its people built meticulously planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, complete with sophisticated grid layouts, advanced water management and drainage systems, and evidence of extensive trade networks. It was, by any measure, a highly organized and successful society. Then, around 1900 BCE, it underwent a rapid decline and eventual collapse. We are left to speculate as to why. Theories range from prolonged drought and shifting river patterns to epidemic disease or external invasion, but the truth remains elusive. What is particularly striking is not just its collapse, but the subsequent amnesia. For centuries afterward, much of what this civilization achieved, including its unique written language, which remains undeciphered to this day, simply vanished from human knowledge. It was a world lost and then forgotten. Consider also the case of the Maya in Central America. At their zenith, the Maya commanded a civilization of immense intellectual and architectural prowess. They built sprawling cities dominated by towering pyramids, developed a highly advanced understanding of astronomy, and created a calendar system of breathtaking complexity and accuracy. Yet centuries before the arrival of Europeans, the great urban centers of the southern lowlands fell into a dramatic decline. Again, the reasons are hotly debated among scholars. A combination of endemic warfare, overpopulation leading to resource depletion, and severe drought are the leading candidates. But the effect was the same. A world that was once vibrant and powerful became fragmented and scattered. Its magnificent stone cities were abandoned, left to be slowly and silently swallowed by the relentless embrace of the jungle. These are just two of the more famous examples we know of, largely because they occurred relatively recently in the grand timeline of human history and left behind substantial physical ruins for us to study. But they force us to ask a much larger and more profound question. What about civilizations that may have existed much earlier, far beyond the horizon of our current archaeological record? If a technologically sophisticated society rose to prominence 30,000, 50,000, or even 100,000 years ago, and then disappeared, what evidence could we realistically expect to find of it today? The sobering answer is, in all likelihood, very little. We view our own modern civilization as a permanent fixture, yet its creations are remarkably fragile. Without constant human maintenance, our cities would not endure for long. In a matter of centuries, roads would crack and be overgrown, buildings would crumble under the assault of the elements, and metal structures would rust into orange dust. In a few thousand years, a dense forest could stand where a bustling metropolis once was. After 50,000 years, only the most massive and durable of our constructions, perhaps the foundations of great dams or the deepest quarries, might remain as subtle, anomalous scars on the landscape, their artificial origins no longer obvious. This implies that a truly ancient and advanced civilization could have existed and left almost no recognizable trace for us to find by the time our own societies began to emerge. Some researchers, however, believe that subtle hints do exist, embedded like fossils in the archaeological and geological record. They point to enduring oddities, such as the colossal stone blocks at Pumapunku in Bolivia, which are cut with a precision that appears to defy the simple tools we attribute to the Tiwanaku culture. Or the megalithic wonder of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a vast ceremonial complex of intricately carved pillars built over 11,000 years ago, long before mainstream history, suggests that human societies were capable of such monumental, organized efforts. Sites like these challenge our neat timelines. Are they simply the work of cultures that were far more advanced than we give them credit for? Or could they be the last vestiges of a transmitted knowledge, a faint echo of a science and engineering passed down from an even earlier, now lost world? Ancient maps offer another strange and tantalizing category of clues. The famous Piri Reis map, compiled in 1513 by a Turkish admiral, appears to show the coastline of South America with remarkable accuracy. More controversially, it also seems to depict a portion of the Antarctic coastline, not as it is today, under a thick sheet of ice, but as a landmass free of ice. If this interpretation is accurate, it would imply that the map was based on source materials from a time before Antarctica was frozen over a time thousands of years in the past. Mainstream scholars vigorously debate these interpretations, but such anomalies continue to fuel the idea that fragments of a forgotten geography, the knowledge of a previous age, might have survived into later eras, hidden in plain sight. This notion is further reinforced by the persistent myths and legends found in cultures all across the globe. These stories often speak of a former golden age, a time when humanity was more advanced or lived in harmony, which was brought to an end by a world-altering catastrophe. The legend of Atlantis, as described by Plato, is the most famous of these, a tale of a highly advanced island nation that was submerged beneath the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. But strikingly similar tales of great floods or fires that wiped the world clean can be found in Sumerian, Hindu, and Judeo-Christian traditions, as well as in the oral histories of countless indigenous peoples across the Americas and Oceania. Are these all just independent flights of imaginative fancy? Or could they be the distant, distorted memories of real events, a cultural trauma passed down through countless generations, preserving the faint memory of real civilizations destroyed long ago? What is so remarkable is the completeness with which these civilizations seem to vanish, leaving behind only scattered ruins or whispered legends. If we view history not as a straight line, but through the lens of possible resets, these sudden disappearances become more comprehensible. A planetary reset, whether triggered by a natural disaster, a rapid climate collapse, a deadly pandemic, or a global war, could effectively erase the majority of a society's cultural and technological achievements almost overnight. A few survivors would be scattered, their sophisticated support networks destroyed. Over generations, cut off from the knowledge of their ancestors, they would regress, and the memory of what was lost would slowly transform into myth. If this cycle has played out more than once, it could elegantly explain why human progress appears to restart at different points in time and in different places around the globe. We may not be building civilization for the first time. We may, in fact, be rebuilding it, each time starting over with only the fragmented pieces that managed to survive the last great collapse. This perspective fundamentally changes how we look at lost civilizations. Instead of seeing them as isolated accidents or historical curiosities, we can begin to see them as chapters in a vast, recurring pattern, with each chapter ending in a reset. Some of these forgotten worlds may have been as technologically advanced as our own. Others may have been different in ways we can no longer imagine, utilizing sciences or philosophies that left few traces for our modern methods to detect. And just as their worlds came to an end, so too, perhaps, could ours. The mystery of lost civilizations is therefore not just an intellectual puzzle. It is an exercise in humility. We tend to see ourselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, the undisputed masters of this planet. But if the reset hypothesis holds any truth, then we are simply the latest in a long forgotten line of societies to stand at the top of the world. And like all those who came before us, we are not immune to the fall. If it's true that history has been reset, that our chapter is but one in a much longer cyclical story, then the world beneath our feet should be haunted by echoes. We shouldn't expect to find a clear, unambiguous message from the past, "We were here," carved into a mountainside. Time is too powerful an eraser for that. Instead, we should expect to find fainter traces, subtle fragments, perplexing anomalies, and puzzles that don't quite fit into the neat boxes of our current understanding of the past. These signs would be the scattered breadcrumbs left behind by vanished worlds. And when you begin to look for them with an open and curious mind, you realize that such anomalies are not as rare as one might think. They exist in sufficient number to at least make you wonder if the story of humanity goes far deeper and is far stranger than we currently believe. One of the most profound and challenging of these signs stands today in modern day. Turkey, the archaeological site of Göbekli Tepe. Mainstream archaeology confidently dates this sprawling complex to around 9,500 BCE, or more than 11,000 years ago. This fact alone is staggering, as it places its construction thousands of years before the accepted birth of agriculture, pottery, writing, or permanent cities. According to the standard timeline, the people of that era should have been small nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers. Yet, Göbekli Tepe is a masterpiece of organized, large-scale construction. It consists of multiple circular enclosures formed by massive, T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 18 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons. These megaliths are decorated with intricate and beautifully executed carvings of animals, like lions, boars, and scorpions. The sheer effort required to quarry, transport, and erect these stones would have demanded a large, coordinated workforce with a sophisticated social structure and a shared, powerful belief system. Göbekli Tepe stands as a direct contradiction to the narrative that monumental architecture is a product of agricultural societies. It forces historians into a difficult position. Either we must radically push back the timeline for when civilization began, or we must consider the unsettling possibility that this knowledge was not invented on the spot, but was perhaps an inheritance from a culture even older and now entirely unknown. This mystery is echoed in megalithic structures scattered across the globe. Consider the great stone platform at Baalbek in Lebanon, which is built with some of the largest worked stones on the planet, including the stone of the pregnant woman, estimated to weigh a colossal 1,200 tons. Or the astonishing stonework of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where enormous polygonal blocks are fitted together with such mortarless precision that not even a sheet of paper can be inserted between them. How were these feats achieved by cultures that supposedly lacked heavy machinery? While orthodox explanations propose remarkable feats of manual labor and simple engineering, the sheer scale and perfection in some cases seem to challenge the limits of those explanations. If we entertain the idea of historical resets, these sites could be viewed differently, not as the beginning of a tradition, but as the end of one. They could be the remnants of techniques learned in a previous, more advanced age, passed down imperfectly through generations of survivors after a great collapse. Another intriguing category of evidence comes in the form of artifacts that seem technologically inconsistent with their era, the so-called out-of-place artifacts, or OOP arts. The most famous and verifiable of these is the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of a Greek island. This astoundingly complex device has been called the world's first analog computer. Dating back over 2,000 years, it is a shoebox-sized contraption of interlocking bronze gears that could be used to predict astronomical positions, track the movements of the sun and moon, and even calculate the timing of eclipses with incredible accuracy. It demonstrates a knowledge of astronomy and mechanics that is utterly unparalleled in any other object from its time. What is most baffling is that after its creation, nothing even remotely as complex appears in the historical record for over 1,000 years. It's a technological island in time. If knowledge of this caliber could exist and then vanish so completely for so long, it becomes far easier to imagine that even greater technologies could have been developed and then disappeared entirely in the deeper past. We also find perplexing hints in the form of ancient maps that appear to contain geographic knowledge that should have been impossible for their time. The previously mentioned Piri-Reis map is a prime example. Compiled in the early 16th century, it seems to depict parts of the Americas and potentially a pre-glacial Antarctica with a level of accuracy that cartographers of that era should not have possessed. Historians often explain this by suggesting the mapmaker copied his work from a collection of much older source maps, which were later lost. This explanation, however, only deepens the mystery. Just how old were those original source maps? And who possessed the technology and geographic knowledge to create them? Then there are the myths not proof, in and of themselves, but nonetheless a strange and compelling form of data, due to their incredible consistency across cultures that had no contact with one another. All over the world, we hear foundational stories of a great world-destroying flood. From the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical story of Noah to the flood legends of the Hopi in North America and the Manu myth in India, there is a shared archetypal theme, a catastrophic deluge that wiped away a previous world, forcing a handful of survivors to start again. If repeated global resets have occurred, triggered by events like rapid sea level rise at the end of an ice age, these myths might be more than just symbolic stories. They could be the garbled, transgenerational memory of very real events, passed down for millennia through oral tradition. Even the very rhythm of innovation in our accepted history could be interpreted as a clue. Consider the so-called Neolithic Revolution, a period where agriculture, animal domestication, and permanent settlements seemed to emerge almost simultaneously and independently in several different regions across the globe. How did such a fundamental transformation in human existence happen so relatively quickly and in such a coordinated fashion? One possibility, of course, is that the conditions were simply right, but another is that this was not a moment of pure invention, but rather one of rediscovery. It could have been a time when scattered human populations, having survived a previous collapse, finally managed to piece back together the foundational knowledge of their ancestors, reigniting the flame of civilization from the embers of a forgotten age. The fundamental challenge is that none of these signs, when viewed in isolation, can definitively prove that history has been reset. Each one can be, and has been explained away within the conventional framework. Gogekli, Tepe is recategorized as the work of anomalously sophisticated hunter-gatherers. The Antikythera mechanism is dismissed as a singular flash of lost genius. The flood myths are interpreted as purely symbolic allegories. But when you step back and view these anomalies, not as isolated data points, but as a collective pattern, a different picture begins to emerge. It is a picture that hints at a past far more complex and dynamic than our linear timelines suggest, a past filled with profound discontinuities, lost knowledge, and forgotten chapters. These are the faint signs, the quiet whispers of ages that may have come before our own. But when you begin to gather these disparate threads, these lonely anomalies, and weave them together, they form a discernible pattern. It is not a loud declaration, but a persistent whisper suggesting that we are only gazing upon the surface of a history far deeper and more mysterious than we can comprehend. Part of the reason these signs are so ephemeral is that time itself is a ruthless editor. Organic materials, the very fabric of early human life, decay into soil. Metals, once symbols of strength, corrode into dust. Even the enduring majesty of stone eventually yields, weathered by wind and water, into sand. The planet itself is an active agent in this erasure. Earthquakes can fracture landscapes, volcanic eruptions can entomb entire regions in ash, and the slow, grinding dance of tectonic plates can bury the works of civilizations deep beneath the earth, hiding them for millennia. Furthermore, some of the most promising locations for finding the remains of truly ancient societies are now profoundly inaccessible to us. During the last ice age, when vast quantities of the world's water were locked up in continental glaciers, sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. Vast, fertile continental shelves, places like Doggerland in the North Sea or Beringia between Asia and North America, were dry, habitable land. It is not just possible, but highly probable, that these coastal plains were home to thriving human populations. If advanced societies developed in these regions, as they so often do along coastlines, their destruction would have been absolute when the ice melted and the seas rose. Their cities, their monuments, and their graves would now be sleeping cities on the ocean floor, shrouded in darkness and immense pressure, their secrets discoverable only through the most arduous and expensive deep-sea exploration. It is also crucial to remember that we are still in the infancy of uncovering our own past. The science of archaeology is remarkably young. It was only in the last century or so that we have developed the tools to truly begin peeling back the layers of time. Just a few hundred years ago, entire civilizations that are now cornerstones of ancient history, like the Maya of Central America or the sophisticated urban culture of the Indus Valley, were completely unknown to the modern world. Their cities lying dormant beneath jungle canopies and earthen mounds. What astonishing discoveries await us in the next 100 years? What new technologies, like satellite imaging or genetic analysis, will reveal? And will some of these future discoveries finally force us to confront the profound possibility that we are not the first? If we dare to take the idea of historical reset seriously, then these scattered clues cease to be mere curiosities or inconvenient outliers. They transform into potential evidence of a vast, repeating cycle. In this cycle, civilizations rise. They attain great heights of knowledge, technology, and cultural power, and then, through cataclysm or decay, they fall, leaving behind only the faintest of fragments. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, are forced to rebuild. Over centuries, the memory of the past erodes, and the fragments of true history become the foundation of myth and legend. Eventually, a new civilization grows, often unknowingly, upon the ruins of the old, destined to repeat the process. The signs of these forgotten ages may be all around us, but they are quiet, subtle, and tragically easy to overlook. They do not shout their message from the mountaintops. They whisper it from inscriptions buried in stone, from allegories hidden in ancient stories, and from the silent, unexplored darkness of the ocean floor. And perhaps the most telling sign of all is how quickly and completely we forget. How easily the traces of even the most magnificent worlds can be scoured from the planet, leaving behind just enough to make us wonder, with a sense of profound awe and sorrow, what might have been. If the cycle of historical resets is indeed a reality, then there must exist forces powerful enough to trigger them. These are not localized disasters, like the burning of a single city or the collapse of a single kingdom. These are events of such a vast and destructive scale that they possess the capacity to erase the collective achievements of entire global civilizations. They are the great erasers of time forces of nature and humanity, so potent they can wipe away cities, obliterate knowledge, and fracture cultures, leaving little more than enigmatic fragments for a distant future to puzzle over. The first, most obvious, and most relentless of these erasers is nature itself. The earth is not a static, benign stage upon which the human drama unfolds. It is an active, dynamic, and often violent participant. Massive volcanic eruptions, for instance, can do more than bury a local area. Think of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, which flash froze the city of Pompeii, preserving a moment of terror for nearly 2 millennia. Now, amplify that power 1,000-fold. A supervolcanic eruption, like the one that occurred at Lake Toba in Indonesia, approximately 74,000 years ago, is believed by some scientists to have triggered a global volcanic winter that lasted for years. Such an event would have blotted out the sun, caused temperatures to plummet, and led to the collapse of ecosystems worldwide. If a technologically sophisticated civilization existed before such an event, its agricultural base would have been annihilated, its cities buried or frozen, and its scattered survivors plunged back into a primitive struggle for existence. Earthquakes are another of nature's relentless tools of erasure. They can shatter the grandest of buildings, liquefy the ground beneath cities, and even cause entire coastlines to sink beneath the waves. Over geological time, the slow but inexorable movement of tectonic plates can subduct ancient landmasses, burying any structures upon them deep within the Earth's mantle, forever beyond our reach. And there is water, perhaps the most thorough and patient eraser of all. While annual floods can be devastating on a local scale, it is the grand changes in sea level that have the power to rewrite the map of the world. At the end of the last ice age, as the planet warmed and the great glaciers melted, the oceans rose by nearly 400 feet. This wasn't a gentle rise. It was a slow-motion deluge that swallowed entire continents' worth of coastal land. As mentioned, vast and potentially populated regions like Doggerland, which once connected Britain to mainland Europe, were inundated. If a civilization was primarily coastal, much as our own is today, a planetary-scale rise in sea level would not just destroy it. It would hide the evidence of its existence in the most inaccessible place imaginable. Fire, too, has long been a destroyer of worlds. A single conflagration can obliterate a city built of wood and thatch. On a planetary scale, a series of megadroughts could lead to continent-spanning wildfires, destroying forests, ruining croplands, and forcing entire populations into a desperate, migratory existence where the preservation of complex knowledge becomes an impossible luxury. Beyond the raw power of nature, humanity itself has proven to be one of the most effective erasers of its own past. War, in its boundless ferocity, is not only destructive in the moment burning cities, slaughtering populations, it is also a calculated destroyer of memory. Throughout history, conquering armies have made a point of destroying libraries, temples, and archives, whether as a strategic act to erase an enemy's cultural identity or simply as a final, nihilistic act of rage. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is the archetypal example, but it is tragically far from unique. Countless other repositories of irreplaceable knowledge have been lost to the flames of conquest, taking with them insights and histories that we will never recover. Famine is another, more silent eraser. A society, no matter how advanced, is only ever a few missed harvests away from collapse. Without a stable food supply, populations falter, cities are abandoned, and complex social structures crumble. When famine is prolonged and widespread, it can trigger mass migrations, shatter political systems, and erase the stability required to maintain and transmit knowledge. Over time, even the memory of the famine's cause can be lost, leaving future generations with only abandoned ruins and a mythology of a golden age before the Great Hunger. Disease, too, has repeatedly acted as a historical reset button. The Black Death in the 14th century is estimated to have wiped out more than a third of Europe's population, leading to profound social, economic, and political upheaval. In the Americas, diseases introduced by European colonizers caused a demographic catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, annihilating entire cultures and languages before they could be meaningfully recorded. If a pandemic of similar virulence struck a globally interconnected civilization in the deep past, it could have brought it to its knees, leaving few survivors and even less knowledge. Finally, there are the cosmic threats rare, but possessing an ultimate power of erasure. A major asteroid or comet impact, like the one that ended the age of the dinosaurs, has the potential to cause a mass extinction event, scouring the planet with fire, tsunamis, and a prolonged impact winter. Even smaller impacts, powerful enough to devastate an entire continent, could trigger a cascading collapse of global civilization. We have found numerous impact craters on Earth that date to within the span of human existence, silent reminders of the destructive power lurking in the cosmos. All of these great erasers share a common, devastating characteristic. They do not just destroy physical things, they destroy continuity. Civilization is a delicate, intricate machine that depends entirely on the unbroken transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. When a cataclysm, whether natural, human-made, or cosmic, is severe enough to kill the keepers of that knowledge, the engineers, the doctors, the historians, the artisans, and destroy the records they kept, the chain of transmission is broken. The survivors may know how to hunt, how to farm on a small scale, or how to build a simple shelter. But the abstract, specialized knowledge required for advanced science, medicine, and technology can vanish in the space of a single lost generation. Once gone, it is incredibly difficult to recover. This is what makes the hypothesis of historical resets so chillingly plausible. The forces required to cause them are not fantastical inventions. They are normal, recurring features of life on this dynamic planet. The only difference between a localized disaster and a full civilizational reset is a matter of scale. And if the scale is large enough, if multiple disasters occur in concert, or if the damage is truly global, a civilization at its zenith could vanish almost without a trace. We often comfort ourselves with the thought that our modern world, with all its technology, is immune to such risks. But in many ways, our interconnectedness makes us more fragile. A massive solar storm could decimate our global power grid and satellite network, plunging us into a darkness from which it would take decades to recover. Our reliance on a globalized food supply makes us exquisitely vulnerable to widespread climate disruption. The great erasers of time are always with us, operating in the background. Most of the time, they act on a small scale, editing a paragraph here or a page there in the book of history. But when they act on a global scale, they do not merely change the story. They restart it. Civilizations that once commanded the planet can be reduced to rubble and myth, leaving the next cycle to begin anew with whatever scraps and whispers of the past managed to survive. If this has happened more than once, it means we are standing upon the ruins of worlds we can never fully know. And if it could happen before, it is a sobering reminder that it could happen again. While human conflict can tear down civilizations, the most profound and complete resets in the planet, as history have likely been orchestrated by a far older and more powerful force, nature itself. It's easy for us, living in our climate-controlled homes and technologically buffered societies, to forget that we exist at the mercy of immense planetary and cosmic systems. Long before humans possessed the ability to reshape the world, nature was already rewriting the story of life on Earth with fire, ice, and stone. Civilizations, no matter how magnificent or advanced, are ultimately fragile constructs in the face of this raw elemental power. Nature has pressed the reset button before, and there is every reason to believe it will do so again. One of its most dramatic instruments of change is volcanic activity. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, though occurring in our well-documented recent past, offers a chilling glimpse of this power. It was the largest eruption in recorded history, and it was potent enough to alter the global climate, causing what became known as the Year Without a Summer in 1816. Snow fell in June in North America, crops failed across the northern hemisphere, and widespread famine ensued. That was just one eruption. Now, transport your imagination back some 74,000 years to the eruption of the Toba supervolcano. The scale of this event is difficult to comprehend. The ash cloud it produced likely shrouded much of the globe, potentially blocking a significant amount of sunlight for years, plunging the planet into a volcanic winter. Some researchers hypothesize that this event created a genetic bottleneck, nearly wiping out the nascent human species and leaving only a few thousand individuals to survive and repopulate the Earth. Any form of advanced society had existed before Toba, it would have been almost completely annihilated, its agricultural systems destroyed, and its population decimated. Earthquakes serve as another stark reminder of nature's untamable strength. While we tend to think of them as localized disasters, a powerful enough quake in a geologically critical location could permanently destroy the key centers of a civilization. Imagine a capital city, the heart of a society's trade, governance, and intellectual life, being reduced to ruins in a matter of minutes. For an ancient society without modern disaster relief or advanced construction techniques, such an event would be an unrecoverable blow, forcing survivors to scatter. Over centuries, the memory of that city's greatness would fade into myth, its ruins slowly buried by new layers of earth, waiting to be discovered by a future age that could only guess at its former glory. But among all of nature's powerful reset mechanisms, none has left a more profound and lasting mark on our world than ice. During the Pleistocene epoch, great ice ages repeatedly saw massive glaciers advance and retreat across the continents, grinding mountains into valleys and fundamentally reshaping the landscape. When these vast ice sheets finally melted at the end of the last glacial period, around 12,000 years ago, they released an almost inconceivable volume of water into the oceans. The resulting sea level rise was not a gentle lapping at the shore. It was a dramatic and sustained inundation that flooded millions of square miles of coastal land. If civilizations existed in these low-lying areas, as human populations are naturally, drawn to do nearly all direct evidence of them would now be submerged hundreds of feet underwater. We have found tantalizing hints of this lost world submerged structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and in the Mediterranean, but these are likely just the shallowest, most accessible traces. The deep ocean floor, which makes up the majority of our planet's surface, remains almost entirely unexplored. It is a silent, dark museum that may hold the remains of entire worlds. Climate change, whether it occurs naturally over millennia or is rapidly accelerated by intelligent activity, is another force that can inexorably reset history. Subtle shifts in rainfall patterns, average temperatures, and ocean currents can render once fertile regions barren and uninhabitable. The classic Maya collapse, for example, is now strongly linked by scientists to a series of prolonged, severe droughts that made supporting their large urban populations impossible. In a world without a globalized network to transport food and resources, a persistent negative shift in the local climate means starvation, mass migration, and ultimately, the dissolution of an entire way of life. In a deep past scenario, such climatic changes could have completely erased a civilization, especially if they occurred with catastrophic speed. Beyond the Earth's own systems, the cosmos poses its own set of existential threats. Asteroid and comet impacts are rare on a human timescale, but on a geological one, they are inevitable. The impact that struck the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago released more energy than billions of atomic bombs, wiping out the dinosaurs and over 75% of all species on Earth. Even a much smaller impact, just a few miles wide, could have devastating global consequences for human civilization, triggering megatsunamis, continent-spanning firestorms, and an impact winter from dust and soot blocking the sun. Craters like the Barringer crater in Arizona are stark reminders that such events are a natural part of Earth's history. What makes these natural resets so devastatingly effective is not just their raw destructive power, but their ability to erase the evidence. A supervolcanic eruption can bury cities under hundreds of feet of ash, sealing them from history. Rising seas can drown entire coastlines, hiding them from view. Advancing glaciers can grind human structures into dust and carry the debris for hundreds of miles. Over thousands of years, the Earth heals itself, covering the scars of catastrophe with new forests, grasslands, and oceans. To a future generation of archaeologists, it can appear as though nothing had ever been there. Our modern world, with its satellites, early warning systems, and global communication networks, can provide a false sense of security. We believe we have tamed nature, but we remain profoundly vulnerable. A massive solar storm could unleash a coronal mass ejection powerful enough to fry the electrical grids and satellite systems that form the bedrock of our civilization. A coordinated series of volcanic eruptions could disrupt global agriculture and transportation. And sea levels are already rising, threatening every major coastal city on the planet. The very same forces that may have ended forgotten civilizations in the past are still with us, quietly waiting. When nature presses the reset button, it doesn't leave a note. It doesn't explain what happened or why. It simply sweeps the board clean and allows life to begin again in whatever form it can manage. If this has happened multiple times in the deep past, it would elegantly explain the perplexing gaps in our historical record, the strange anomalies we cannot account for, and why advanced cultures sometimes seem to appear out of nowhere, as if they were built upon a forgotten foundation. The survivors of each great natural reset would be forced to start over, carrying only fragmented memories and myths from the world that came before. And perhaps, without even realizing it, we are already living amongst the ruins of those very worlds. When we contemplate the forces that can erase a civilization, we often envision the raw, impersonal power of nature. But history bears witness to another force, one born of human consciousness, that has proven to be just as effective, pressing the reset button: war. We tend to focus on war's immediate and visible destruction, the shattered cities, the ravaged landscapes, the tragic loss of life. But war inflicts a second, quieter, and often more permanent kind of death, the erasure of knowledge. Buildings can be rebuilt, and populations, given time, can recover. But once the accumulated wisdom of a culture, its science, its philosophy, its art, its history is systematically destroyed, it is often lost for good. In this way, war can act as a powerful civilizational reset, forcing humanity to painfully relearn what it once knew, to reinvent wheels that had already been turning for centuries. Throughout our recorded past, warfare has repeatedly and brutally wiped away centuries of intellectual progress in the span of a few years, or even a few days. The most iconic, almost mythical, example is the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. This was not merely a collection of books. It was the intellectual heart of the ancient world, a vast repository of scrolls and manuscripts containing the collective knowledge of Greek, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian civilizations. While its decline was gradual, culminating in several destructive events, the result was an incalculable loss. We can only speculate about the scientific treatises, historical records, and philosophical works that vanished forever. How different might our world be today if the knowledge contained within those scrolls had survived to inform the Renaissance and the scientific revolution? It represents a historical reset in miniature, a breaking of the chain of knowledge that forced subsequent generations to start again in darkness. The fall of the Western Roman Empire provides another, more protracted example. At its zenith, Rome commanded a sophisticated understanding of engineering, sanitation, law, and logistics. Their aqueducts, concrete structures, and continent-spanning road networks were feats of technical brilliance. But as the empire crumbled under the weight of internal conflict and external invasions, this intricate system fell apart. More importantly, the knowledge required to maintain it was lost. The specific formula for Roman concrete, a material far more durable than many modern equivalents, vanished. The engineering principles behind the aqueducts were forgotten. For centuries, across much of Europe, the level of technology and social organization regressed significantly. This period, often called the Dark Ages, illustrates how a protracted state of warfare can dismantle a complex society and erase its most advanced skills. War destroys knowledge through a multifaceted assault. First, it directly targets the physical repositories of information. Libraries, universities, archives, and temples are often looted and burned, either as strategic targets or as collateral damage. Second, and perhaps more tragically, war kills or displaces the human vessels of that knowledge. The scientists, artisans, engineers, and teachers who carry a society's practical and theoretical wisdom in their minds can be lost in a single brutal campaign. Third, war systematically disrupts the very systems that are designed to preserve and transmit knowledge. When schools are closed, when trade routes that facilitate the exchange of ideas are severed, and when society's primary focus shifts to mere survival, the delicate process of passing complex skills from one generation to the next is broken. Sometimes this destruction of knowledge, this epistemicide, is brutally deliberate. Conquerors throughout history have understood that to truly dominate a people, you must erase their history and weaken their cultural identity. The Spanish conquest of the Americas involved the systematic destruction of countless Maya and Aztec codices. These beautifully illustrated books were not just religious texts. They were detailed records of history, astronomy, mathematics, and genealogy. By burning them, the conquistadors were not just imposing a new religion. They were deliberately resetting the cultural memory of entire civilizations, ensuring their own narrative would replace what came before. Similarly, the Mongol invasions of the 13th century left a trail of intellectual devastation. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, they destroyed the House of Wisdom, the epicenter of learning in the Islamic Golden Age. This grand library held priceless works from across the known world. Historical accounts tell of so many manuscripts being thrown into the Tigris River that the water ran black with ink for days. This was not just a cultural tragedy. It was a blow that set back scientific and philosophical progress in the region for generations. War also resets history in a more insidious way, by controlling the narrative. The victors, as the saying goes, write the history books. They often recast the past to legitimize their own rule, demonize their enemies, and erase inconvenient truths. Over time, these carefully constructed, biased accounts become the accepted version of events, while the authentic history of the vanquished fades into obscurity or myth. In this sense, the reset is not merely physical, but psychological, fundamentally reshaping how future generations perceive their own origins. If we apply this grim reality to the possibility of much older, unrecorded resets, it is terrifyingly easy to construct a plausible scenario. Imagine a globally interconnected, highly advanced civilization in the deep past. A world-spanning conflict, fought with technologies we can only guess at, could have shattered its complex systems of trade, communication, and energy production. In the aftermath, with cities in ruins and the environment perhaps irrevocably damaged, the survivors would be thrown back into a struggle for basic necessities. Specialized skills in fields like genetics, quantum physics, or advanced metallurgy would become useless and would vanish within a single generation. Within a few centuries, the descendants of this advanced civilization might be living in simple agricultural communities, their only connection to the past a collection of confusing myths about sky gods, fiery chariots, and a lost paradise. In this way, war does not just erase the past. It creates a false present. It can leave a society convinced that its current state of development is the highest it has ever achieved, when in reality, it may be a mere shadow of a former greatness. When we gaze upon the ruins of ancient fortified cities, it's easy to assume they fell into a slow decline. But the lesson of history is that they could have been emptied and silenced almost overnight, their libraries burned, and their wisdom scattered to the winds in the chaos of conflict. War, as an eraser of history, is a perfect mechanism for the reset hypothesis. It is capable not only of destroying the physical remnants of a civilization, but, more critically, of severing the sacred chain of knowledge that connects one generation to the next. And once that chain is broken, the reset is complete. When we try to peer into the deep past, we instinctively imagine history as something tangible and permanent. A vast library of events stored securely on stone tablets, in leather-bound books, or in museum archives, just waiting for us to find and read them. But this is a comforting illusion. The truth is that the record of our past is an exquisitely fragile thing. It does not take a cataclysmic war or a volcanic eruption for it to disappear. Most of human history has already vanished, not through violent destruction, but through a much quieter and more relentless process, simple passive decay. This is the vanishing records problem, a fundamental reality that without a continuous, active, and resource-intensive effort to preserve them, the traces of any civilization will inevitably fade until almost nothing remains. The first and most formidable challenge is the inherent impermanence of the materials humans use. The vast majority of our creations are made from organic substances like paper, papyrus, cloth, leather, and wood. Exposed to the elements, to moisture, oxygen, sunlight, and microbes, these materials break down with surprising speed. A single fire can incinerate a library in an evening. A flood can turn centuries of records into a pulpy, illegible mass. An infestation of insects can devour a collection of manuscripts from the inside out. Even our seemingly more durable records are vulnerable. Metal corrodes, ink fades, and inscriptions on stone are slowly but surely worn away by wind and rain. Even in our modern digital age, where we produce more information than ever before, the problem has not been solved. It has merely changed its form. We may think of our data as existing in an incorporeal cloud, but it is physically stored on hard drives and solid-state memory in vast, energy-hungry server farms. These storage media have a limited lifespan, often failing within a decade. The data formats themselves become obsolete. Files created on a computer from the 1990s are often unreadable on modern machines without specialized software. Most critically, our entire digital civilization is utterly dependent on a constant supply of electricity. A prolonged global power outage would not just turn off the lights. It would effectively render the bulk of our civilization's knowledge inaccessible and eventually lost, as the magnetic charges that represent our data slowly fade away. A stone tablet can survive for millennia through simple neglect. A hard drive cannot survive for a decade without constant attention and power. This makes our current age arguably the most fragile in history in terms of long-term data preservation. Think of information not as a static object, but as a living organism. It needs to be housed, protected, and periodically copied or reproduced onto new media to survive. Every time a scribe in a medieval monastery painstakingly copied an ancient text, they were ensuring its survival for another generation. Every time a librarian today digitizes a decaying book, they are doing the same. But this process of preservation requires stability, resources, and a society that values its own history. If that stability is disrupted, even for a few generations, the chain of preservation is broken, and vast swaths of knowledge can quietly slip into oblivion. This vanishing records problem creates an immense bias in our understanding of the past. What survives for archaeologists to find is not a representative sample of a culture. It is almost always the material that was the most durable: stone, ceramic, precious metals, or that which was preserved by a fluke of circumstance, such as being buried in a dry desert cave or a low-oxygen peat bog. We know vastly more about ancient societies that built with stone than those that built with wood. We have extensive records from cultures that wrote on clay tablets, which were often accidentally fired and preserved during city fires, while the knowledge of cultures that wrote on palm leaves or bark has almost entirely disappeared. This means our picture of the past is profoundly incomplete, like trying to understand an entire ecosystem by studying only the fossilized bones. We see the skeletons of history, but the soft tissue, the stories, the songs, the daily customs, the scientific theories written on perishable materials is almost entirely gone. If an ancient civilization existed that was highly advanced in non-material sciences like biology, social organization, or consciousness, but did not prioritize monumental stone construction, they could have vanished, leaving almost no trace that we would recognize. A vanishing records problem is the silent, constant background noise of history. It is the reason why the further back we look, the fuzzier the picture becomes, until we reach a point where there is nothing but silence. It operates independently of any great cataclysm. It is the natural entropy of information. If we consider the possibility of resets, this process acts as the final eraser. After a great disaster scatters a population and breaks the chain of knowledge, a vanishing records problem ensures that whatever physical information was left behind will slowly decay, making a full recovery of the lost knowledge nearly impossible for any descendants. It guarantees that after a reset, the past is not just forgotten, but truly lost. If a cataclysmic reset were to occur today, our most prized creation, the digital universe, would be among the first casualties. The vast majority of our collective history, our art, our science, and our personal stories, stored as ephemeral magnetic charges and pulses of light, could become utterly unreadable within a few short decades. This modern fragility highlights a much deeper and more ancient issue: the vanishing records problem. We often fail to appreciate the sheer scale of our own historical amnesia. Archaeologists and historians estimate that what we call written history, actual recorded accounts of events, stretches back only about 5,000 years. Yet, anatomically modern humans, beings with the same cognitive capacities as us, have walked this earth for roughly 300,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. To put it in perspective, if the entire history of modern humanity were a single 24-hour day, our whole recorded history from the first Sumerian clay tablets to the tweet you read this morning would occupy only the last 2.5 minutes. That leaves an immense, silent gap of 23 hours and 57 minutes, a period filled only by scattered stone tools, fossilized bones, and an enormous amount of educated guesswork. We reflexively label this vast expanse of time as prehistoric or pre-civilization, but that is an assumption born of absence. It is an argument from silence. We assume it was a primitive time, largely because we have no records from it. But is it not possible that complex societies, even great civilizations, rose and fell within that immense chasm of time, their stories now utterly lost because they left behind almost nothing we would recognize as a record? The materials of history are themselves unforgivingly transient. We revere stone monuments and carvings as symbols of permanence, but even they are not eternal. The slow, patient work of wind and water, the sudden violence of earthquakes, and the simple, relentless process of erosion wear them down. Inscriptions that were once sharp and clear can become illegible blurs in just a few thousand years. Entire buildings can collapse, their stones scattered, before being swallowed by the earth. In the humid, aggressive growth of a dense jungle, or beneath the ever-shifting sands of a desert, even the most magnificent ruins can vanish from sight completely. Without the constant, active hand of maintenance, nature inevitably and silently reclaims everything. Sometimes, the loss of history is not passive decay, but an act of practical, deliberate clearance. In a world where resources were scarce, the past was often seen as a quarry for the present. In ancient Egypt, stone from older, dilapidated temples was frequently repurposed for the construction of new monuments. This was not seen as vandalism, but as a sensible recycling of valuable material. Across medieval Europe, scribes engaged in a practice that is heartbreaking to modern historians. They would take old parchment manuscripts, painstakingly scrape away the original ink, and reuse the expensive vellum to write new texts. To them, the immediate need for writing material was far more important than preserving what might have been a forgotten philosophical treatise or a unique historical account. As a result of this pragmatism, countless older records were methodically and permanently erased by the very people who were supposed to be preserving knowledge. The fires of war and conquest only compound this problem exponentially. A single siege or invasion can result in the obliteration of archives, libraries, and temples that house the accumulated memory of an entire culture. But even without the drama of conflict, records can be lost simply because the societies that created them saw no compelling need for their long-term preservation. Many cultures, for vast stretches of time, relied almost exclusively on oral tradition. Stories, genealogies, songs, and sacred teachings were passed from one person to another, from elder to apprentice, in an unbroken chain of human memory. This can be a remarkably robust system for a time, but it is also inherently fragile. Over generations, details inevitably shift, facts become embellished or forgotten, and the original precise knowledge slowly dissolves into the symbolic waters of legend and myth. Then there is the profound issue of selective preservation. History is not a neutral, objective record of everything that happened. What is kept is almost always a reflection of what the powerful believe is worth keeping. Rulers, governments, and religious institutions throughout time have acted as the curators of the past, deciding what stories should be told and, just as importantly, what should be forgotten. Inconvenient, heretical, or politically dangerous information has been systematically suppressed and erased. This official history problem means that even when records do survive, they may be presenting a carefully curated and sanitized version of the truth, not the whole, messy reality. Finally, we must confront the immense role of pure, dumb chance. Our knowledge of the past is shaped profoundly by sheer accident. We know the intimate details of daily life in the Roman city of Pompeii, not because it was the most important city of its time, but because it had the unique fate of being flash fossilized by a blanket of volcanic ash, preserving it in stunning detail. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a priceless collection of ancient Jewish texts, survived for 2 millennia only because they were sealed in clay jars and hidden away in the dry, stable environment of desert caves. Had those specific unlikely events not occurred, we would know nothing of them. This means that our entire picture of history is a mosaic shaped by randomness, built from the rare cases where the conditions were just right for preservation. When we apply this understanding to the possibility of historical resets, The vanishing records problem becomes the central pillar of the argument. If a global civilization were to collapse, whether due to a natural disaster, a pandemic, or a devastating war, the survival of its knowledge would depend almost entirely on luck. Without a continuous chain of people actively copying, protecting, and transmitting its records, that knowledge would begin to fade. Within 1,000 years, it is entirely plausible that almost no discernible trace of that civilization's greatest intellectual achievements would remain, no matter how advanced it had been. It is a sobering thought to realize just how close we are to losing our own modern records. If the global electrical grid were to fail tomorrow, our digital archives, the entirety of the internet, the contents of our libraries, the data of our governments would begin to degrade almost immediately. Within a few decades, without the specific hardware and software to read them, most of our digital files would be as indecipherable as an unknown hieroglyph. Our paper records would fare slightly better, but they too would eventually succumb to mold, water, and time without climate-controlled storage. In the grand geological timescale of history, the lifespan of most of our information is shockingly, terrifyingly short. This inherent fragility is precisely why the official history we have today might represent only a single, surviving chapter of a much longer book. The civilizations we know about are, by definition, the ones whose records survived, either by deliberate effort or by a lucky roll of the cosmic dice. But there could have been others, perhaps many others, whose stories have been completely and irrevocably erased. If resets have occurred, each cycle would have acted like a great filter, wiping away the vast majority of a civilization's records and forcing the survivors to begin anew with only fragmented memories and myths. Even the ruins we do manage to find can be misleading. A handful of perplexing artifacts, without the written context to explain them, cannot tell us the full story of a culture's achievements. We are forced to guess at their meaning, their function, their significance. This process inevitably leads to gaps, to misinterpretations, and sometimes to the outright dismissal of discoveries that do not fit comfortably within the established timeline. The vanishing records problem is a constant, humbling reminder that history is not a fixed, complete narrative. It is a fragile patchwork of surviving scraps, stitched together as best we can. And in that patchwork, there are enormous, gaping holes. Holes where entire worlds, entire civilizations, could have existed, thrived, and fallen without leaving enough behind for us to ever know they were here. If the past has been reset, those missing records are not a minor inconvenience for historians. They are the very reason we cannot see the full picture. They are the profound, echoing silence between the few fragments we have managed to preserve. And in that silence, the truth of our real deep history might still be hiding. One of the most compelling and perplexing aspects of studying the deep past is the occasional discovery of an artifact or structure that seems to defy its own timeline. Every so often, we stumble across evidence suggesting that certain ancient peoples may have possessed a degree of knowledge or a level of technological sophistication far beyond what we conventionally credit them for. These anomalous discoveries directly challenge the smooth, linear narrative of progress from primitive tools to modern machines. They hint at a past that was far more complex, with peaks of stunning achievement that are difficult to explain. They raise the tantalizing possibility that at least some ancient societies were not inventing from scratch, but were instead the inheritors of skills and wisdom from an earlier, forgotten age, an age that was erased by a civilizational reset. The Antikythera mechanism is perhaps the most celebrated and scientifically verified example of this phenomenon. Discovered in a 2,000-year-old Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek coast, it is an object of breathtaking complexity. To the untrained eye, it is a corroded lump of bronze. But through X-ray analysis, we now know it is an intricate assembly of at least 30 interlocking gears and dials, a device that has been rightly called the world's first analog computer. By turning a hand crank, an ancient user could accurately predict the positions of the sun, moon, and visible planets, track the lunar calendar, and even foretell the timing of solar and lunar eclipses. It represents a level of mechanical engineering and astronomical knowledge that we previously thought was impossible for that period. What makes the Antikythera mechanism so profoundly strange is its utter solitude. It is a technological orphan. Nothing even remotely as complex appears in the archaeological record for over 1,000 years afterward. How does such a sophisticated piece of technology materialize, seemingly out of nowhere, and then vanish without a trace? One conventional explanation is that it was the work of a singular, lost genius. But another, more provocative explanation is that it was not a new invention at all, but rather a surviving application of a much older, lost tradition of precision mechanics, a faint echo from a world that had already vanished. This sense of inherited, rather than developed, knowledge is also felt when standing before the massive stone constructions found around the globe. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, is a marvel not just of scale, but of almost supernatural precision. It is aligned to the cardinal points of the compass with an accuracy that rivals modern surveying. The massive stones that form its base, some weighing as much as an elephant, create a foundation that is level to within a fraction of an inch across its entire 13-acre footprint. The casing stones were fitted together with such hair's-breadth accuracy that a thin piece of paper cannot be slid between them. Modern engineers acknowledge that replicating such a feat today, even with our advanced technology, would be a monumental challenge. How did ancient builders, supposedly equipped with only simple copper tools and raw manpower, achieve such perfection? Was it simply the result of unimaginable patience and skill? Or were they working with techniques and principles of engineering that have since been forgotten? Similar mysteries confront us in the mountains of South America. At sites like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo in Peru, we find megalithic walls constructed from enormous, multi-ton polygonal blocks of stone. These blocks are not uniform. They are irregularly shaped, yet they are fitted together without mortar so tightly that they have endured centuries of powerful earthquakes. The sheer scale is baffling. Some of these stones are so large that moving and placing them today would require industrial cranes and heavy machinery. Yet they were somehow quarried, transported over difficult terrain, and positioned with flawless precision by cultures we believe lacked the wheel for transport, iron tools, and industrial power. Ancient India offers its own set of intellectual puzzles. Vedic texts, composed thousands of years ago, describe a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. They contain startlingly accurate calculations for the length of the solar year and the lunar cycle, and even allude to a heliocentric model of the solar system, with the Earth orbiting the Sun. While it is certainly possible, these insights were derived solely from naked-eye observation. Over many centuries, the level of precision has led some to question whether this knowledge could have been preserved from an even earlier, more scientifically advanced period. There are also physical artifacts that hint at lost sciences. The so-called Baghdad Battery, a collection of terracotta jars containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, was discovered in modern-day Iraq and dates back some 2,000 years. Experiments have shown that when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or grape juice, these jars can produce a small but steady electric current. If this was their intended purpose, it would suggest a working knowledge of the principles of electricity more than 1,500 years before Alessandro Volta's invention of the battery. Some archaeologists speculate they may have been used for electroplating objects with a thin layer of gold or silver, a process we consider to be relatively modern. Even the way ancient stones were cut sometimes suggests tools that shouldn't have existed. At Pamapangtu in Bolivia, blocks of andesite, an incredibly hard volcanic rock, have been shaped with perfectly straight edges, flawless right angles, and precise, smoothbore drill holes. To achieve this level of precision on such a hard material, using only the simple stone and bronze tools, we believe the Tiwanaku culture Possessed would be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. The evidence on the stones seems to cry out for advanced tools, perhaps even powered machinery. If they possessed such tools, where did that technology originate, and where did it go? Skeptics and mainstream archaeologists argue, often compellingly, that all these feats can be explained through sufficient ingenuity, massive amounts of organized labor, and immense spans of time. And in many cases, they may be correct. We should never underestimate the capabilities of our ancestors. But when taken together, these anomalies form a persistent nagging pattern, sudden inexplicable bursts of technological or engineering brilliance that do not seem to fit the gradual linear progression of history, often followed by long periods where these abilities appear to be lost. If history has indeed been subject to resets, these strange artifacts and structures are no longer anomalies. They become the expected remnants of knowledge carried over from a previous cycle. They are fragments of a lost science, echoes of a forgotten engineering that survived long enough to be implemented by a later culture, but not long enough to be fully understood, preserved, and passed on to the future. Technology, it is crucial to remember, is not always physical hardware. Advanced knowledge can also be software, mathematics, astronomy, navigation, medicine. This kind of knowledge is even more easily lost. The Polynesian navigators, for example, could cross thousands of miles of open ocean to find tiny islands using only their profound understanding of the stars, ocean swells, and bird migration patterns. This was an incredibly sophisticated intellectual technology. If such a skill were to be lost in a societal collapse, it might take thousands of years for another culture to rediscover its principles. When we consider the possibility of resets, the existence of advanced ancient technology becomes one of the most compelling lines of evidence. If a highly developed global civilization existed tens of thousands of years ago and was subsequently obliterated by a catastrophe, it is plausible that a few scattered pieces of its knowledge might have survived. This knowledge could have been embedded in myths, preserved in a handful of durable artifacts, or passed down in a fragmented, incomplete form through a lineage of survivors. Over millennia, these fragments could resurface in later, rebuilding civilizations, creating those astonishing moments in history where technology seems to leap forward unexpectedly, only to stall or vanish once more. This would explain why certain ancient achievements feel so out of place, as if they were borrowed from a different, more advanced timeline. It would suggest that what we perceive as the first invention of something might actually be a reinvention, sparked by the rediscovery of a very old idea whose true origins have long been forgotten. If resets are real, then advanced technology in the ancient world is not a puzzle to be explained away. It is a clue. It is evidence that we may be living in just one of many technological peaks humanity has reached, each one built upon the faint, lingering echoes of the one that came before. And just as those earlier peaks vanished into the mists of time, so too, perhaps, could ours. One of the more curious and revealing patterns woven into the tapestry of human history is the phenomenon of repeated discovery. Certain pivotal inventions and concepts seem to appear more than once, often in completely different parts of the world, separated by vast distances and thousands of years. The conventional explanation for this is independent invention, the logical idea that different groups of people, when faced with similar environmental challenges or social needs, will eventually arrive at similar solutions. While this undoubtedly accounts for many cases, the sheer consistency of these rediscoveries opens the door to a more intriguing possibility. What if some of these inventions are not entirely new creations at all? What if they are, in fact, reinventions, the reappearance of ideas and technologies that were known in earlier ages, before a great reset erased them from the world's collective memory? Consider the revolutionary act of writing. Historians generally agree that writing was developed independently in at least 5 different regions: Sumer in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and Mesoamerica. Each of these systems is visually distinct, with its own unique symbols and grammar. Yet, the fundamental and abstract concept that spoken language can be represented by durable, visible marks seems to have burst forth in each of these places. This marks a sudden quantum leap from a purely oral tradition to a world of recorded history. It is as if the very idea of writing, once sparked, took root in fertile ground. Could this mean that the core concept, or perhaps even physical examples of an even older script, survived from an antediluvian time and acted as a catalyst for these later, independent-looking inventions? Metallurgy offers another compelling case. The complex process of smelting metals, extracting them from ore using high temperatures, and then creating alloys, like bronze, emerged in different parts of the world at different times. Each emergence is typically treated as a fresh, local discovery. But the process is far from simple. It requires a sophisticated understanding of mining, furnace construction, temperature control, and chemistry. It is entirely possible that these intricate skills were painstakingly learned, then tragically lost in a societal collapse, only to be painstakingly relearned thousands of years later by a different culture. Agriculture follows a strikingly similar pattern. The standard narrative teaches that farming began around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and then spread across the globe. However, a wealth of archaeological evidence now shows that the domestication of unique sets of plants and animals also occurred independently in East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, and New Guinea. This might simply be a testament to human adaptability. Or it could suggest a different story, that the foundational knowledge of agriculture was practiced long before our current starting point was lost during a global cataclysm, like the end of the Ice Age, and was then reintroduced or rediscovered by scattered groups of survivors around the world. The skill of sophisticated navigation, too, seems to rise and fall like the tides. The Polynesian voyagers mastered the art of crossing the vast, featureless Pacific Ocean. They developed a breathtakingly precise system using star paths, wave patterns, and the flight of birds, allowing them to travel thousands of miles between tiny, isolated islands without the aid of compasses, sextants, or modern charts. This knowledge was a form of high technology, passed down through rigorous training. In some parts of Polynesia, this art was later lost and had to be painstakingly reconstructed from the fragmented memories preserved in oral traditions. Similar patterns of advanced seafaring techniques appear to be gained and lost in the Mediterranean and other parts of the world. Even an invention as seemingly fundamental as the wheel has a puzzling and discontinuous history. The oldest known wheels for transport appear around 3,500 BCE in Mesopotamia. Yet, this revolutionary invention did not immediately spread everywhere. In some regions, wheeled vehicles appear in the archaeological record quite suddenly, with designs that are already fairly sophisticated. Why would such a profoundly useful invention take millennia to appear in certain areas, unless the knowledge of its construction and use had to be reintroduced or rediscovered after having been forgotten? This cycle of gaining, losing, and regaining knowledge is a perfect fit for the hypothesis of multiple historical resets. If this model is correct, the pattern makes complete sense. A civilization achieves a certain level of technological sophistication. Then, a catastrophe strikes, wiping out the majority of the population and destroying its infrastructure. The survivors, focused on mere existence, pass on only fragmented pieces of the old knowledge. Without the societal context and technical support systems, the skills are incomplete and often degrade into myth. Generations or even millennia later, these fragments a strange artifact, a half-remembered legend, and observed natural principle act as a seed, inspiring a new generation to invent something that feels entirely new, but which is in fact an echo of a much older achievement. The repeated invention of similar tools and systems might also explain why certain developments seem to leap forward without a long, clumsy period of trial and error. When the arch appears in architecture, it is often already a functional and elegant solution. When complex calendars re-emerge, they are already capable of tracking celestial cycles with great accuracy. These do not always look like the tentative, faltering first steps of an entirely new idea. They often look like the refined products of a technology that has been practiced before. It is also worth considering that humans are, above all, storytellers. The survivors of a global collapse might not have the ability to preserve technical schematics or scientific textbooks, but they could preserve the memory of a technology through myth. A legend about a chariot of the gods that flew through the sky might, centuries later, inspire a curious mind to experiment with the principles of flight. A story about a magical spring that healed the sick might lead to the rediscovery of a location with unique medicinal minerals. Over time, these rediscoveries would enter the historical record as brand new innovations, even though their original spark came from a very old, fragmented memory. Mainstream history tends to compartmentalize these cases, labeling each as an independent and isolated development. But when you step back and observe the broader pattern, the same key ideas and technologies emerging over and over again across time and space, it raises profound questions. Why do humans keep solving the same problems in such similar ways? Why do certain brilliant ideas vanish for centuries, only to return as if they had never left? If history has been reset more than once, the answer might be quite simple. We've been down this road before. We have built, lost, and rebuilt the same core technologies many times over. The puzzle of repeated inventions is not a series of coincidences. It is the very rhythm of the cyclical history. This possibility is both humbling and deeply unsettling. It means that much of what we consider to be the unique and crowning achievement of our own age may have existed, in some form, in lost worlds. It also implies that if another reset were to occur, many of our most cherished modern inventions could one day be rediscovered by a future people who would have no idea that we were ever here. When historians and scientists endeavor to reconstruct the distant past, they rely on a hierarchy of evidence. At the top are tangible artifacts, physical ruins, and most prized of all, written records. At the very bottom of this hierarchy, often dismissed as unreliable and unscientific, are the ancient myths, legends, and oral traditions of our ancestors. These stories, passed down through countless generations, are typically treated as symbolic fables, religious allegories, or purely fictional tales designed to explain the natural world. Yet when you suspend disbelief and approach these myths as a different kind of data, as a highly distorted, compressed, and poetic form of history, something remarkable happens. You begin to see recurring patterns and themes that resonate across disconnected cultures with startling consistency, suggesting they may be preserving the distant, traumatized memories of real global events from a time long before our written history began. One of the most powerful and ubiquitous of these themes is the myth of a great flood. We know it most famously from the biblical story of Noah and his ark, but that is just one version of a tale told across the entire planet. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh contains a much older account of a world-destroying deluge. Hindu texts describe the flood of Manu, who is saved by the god Vishnu, and countless indigenous traditions from the tribes of North America to the peoples of the Pacific Islands feature their own foundational stories of a cataclysmic flood that wiped away a former world, allowing a handful of survivors to begin anew. Mainstream historians often interpret these as localized flood events, or perhaps a faint cultural memory of the very real sea level rise that occurred at the end of the last ice age. But viewed through the lens of the reset hypothesis, these myths take on a much more profound significance. Could they be the collective, mythologized memory of one or more global catastrophes that truly did erase entire worlds? Another recurring theme is the archetype of the civilizing hero, or gods from the sky. In culture after culture, we find stories of divine or semi-divine beings who descended to Earth in a time of chaos and taught humanity the essential skills of civilization: agriculture, law, writing, architecture, and astronomy. In ancient Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki were a group of deities said to have given humanity its foundational knowledge. In ancient Egypt, the god Thoth was credited with the invention of writing and science. In Mesoamerican cultures, the feathered serpent deity Quetzalcoatl is revered as the bringer of wisdom and learning. If we strip away the supernatural and metaphorical language, these stories could be interpreted in a fascinating new light. They could be the legends born from the interaction between primitive, post-cataclysm survivors and the remnants of a more advanced group, perhaps the inheritors of knowledge from a pre-recent civilization, who sought to pass on fragments of their lost world to a struggling humanity. Many mythologies also speak of a golden age, a distant primordial time when the world was in a state of perfection. In this age, the climate was perpetually mild, the earth was abundant, and humanity lived in peace and prosperity without the need for labor. These idyllic periods always come to a sudden and tragic end, usually through a divine punishment or a natural disaster, leading to a decline into the harder, more chaotic times of the present. In the Greek tradition, the poet Hesiod described a sequence of 5 ages of man, beginning with the Golden Age and progressively degenerating to the current Iron Age. Hindu cosmology divides time into a great cycle of 4 yugas, with each age representing a gradual decline in virtue and wisdom. This cyclical view of history, a repeating pattern of rise, peak, fall, and reset, aligns perfectly with the idea that civilizations have not followed a linear path of progress, but have instead risen and fallen multiple times. Then there are the persistent myths of lost lands and vanished cities. The story of Atlantis, as recounted by the Greek philosopher Plato, is the most famous example. He described it as a mighty and technologically advanced island civilization that was destroyed and sank into the sea, a single day and night of misfortune. While most modern scholars treat the story of Atlantis as a philosophical allegory, similar tales of sunken lands are found all over the world. There is the legend of the lost continent of Lemuria, or Mu in the Pacific, the sunken land of Lyoness in Cornish folklore, and the submerged kingdoms in Celtic and Welsh traditions. Could these be nothing more than cautionary tales, or are they the distorted, dreamlike memories of real places, coastal civilizations and islands that were lost to the rising seas or to sudden geological upheavals? Most provocatively, some ancient myths describe what sound uncannily like advanced technologies, framed in the language of magic and divine power. Ancient Indian epics, like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, speak of flying machines called vimanas, which could travel through the sky at great speeds. They also describe devastating superweapons, like the Brahmastra, whose effects, a searing light, boiling waters, and poisoned lands, bear a chilling resemblance to modern descriptions of a nuclear explosion. While these are presented as the powers of gods and demons, it is possible that such fantastic imagery was inspired by the fragmented memory of real, long-lost technologies, their workings misunderstood and exaggerated over countless centuries of retelling. The great challenge in using myths as historical evidence is that they are not straightforward accounts. They are layered with symbolism, moral lessons, religious dogma, and cultural embellishments. Over generations, details are added, characters are merged, and timelines are compressed. But even with all this noise, certain core elements, the signal remained remarkably consistent across cultures that had no physical contact. When those core elements appear to align with geological evidence of past catastrophes, with archaeological anomalies, or with astronomical records, it becomes far more difficult to dismiss them as mere fiction. Perhaps it is time we started listening to these stories differently, not as fairy tales, but as the last surviving echoes of worlds that have otherwise been lost to a great and profound silence. For instance, the near-universal myths about a great, world-ending flood might align with the dramatic geological evidence of massive glacial melting and catastrophic coastal flooding that occurred at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Stories from disparate cultures that speak of fiery destruction raining down from the sky could correspond to the documented history of meteor showers and impact events. Myths that describe a long darkness covering the land, a sun that disappears for years, could be the preserved, terrified memories of supervolcanic eruptions that choked the atmosphere with ash. And the persistent romantic legends of lost islands and sunken continents might find their real-world counterparts in the vast areas of the continental shelf, like Doggerland or Sunderland, that were once dry, habitable land before the oceans rose and swallowed them. If history has indeed been reset more than once, then these myths could be the only surviving records from those erased ages. They are a library of ghosts. Instead of being preserved on stone, papyrus, or paper materials that are ultimately fragile, their information was encoded and preserved within the most resilient and portable medium of all, the human mind. This knowledge was carried across the abyss of time through the chain of generations, inevitably reshaped by culture, language, and imagination, but still holding within its symbolic core the faint, distorted echoes of real-world altering events. The people who passed these stories down may not have understood the scientific nature of the events themselves. A meteor impact would simply be the wrath of a sky god, a volcanic winter, a punishment from the Earth Mother. They simply repeated, with ritualistic gravity, what their ancestors had told them. Over time, these traumatic memories were clothed in the rich garments of the myths we know today. What makes this possibility even more intriguing is the phenomenon of thematic resonance. Myths from cultures separated by vast oceans and millennia, with no known historical contact, often contain strikingly similar and specific motifs. How did nearly identical stories of a great flood, of civilizing sky gods, and of a lost golden age end up in the traditions of both the ancient Near East and the indigenous peoples of the Americas? How did the sophisticated philosophical idea of a cyclical history of great ages that rise and fall in a repeating pattern appear independently in both Greek and Hindu traditions? If these cultures were not directly connected, the simplest and most elegant explanation might be that they were not inventing these stories from scratch. Instead, they were all drawing from a common well of memory, a shared, deeply ancient, and now largely forgotten human past. Of course, skeptics rightfully argue that these thematic similarities are common because they are rooted in universal human experiences and archetypes. Every human culture has witnessed destructive floods, has been awed by the power of thunderstorms, and has gazed up at the stars in wonder. It is only natural, they contend, that similar symbolic stories would emerge independently to explain these phenomena. That is certainly a plausible and logical explanation. But the reset hypothesis offers a compelling alternative, that humanity shares not just a similar psychology, but also the fragmented and dreamlike memories of a shared, forgotten history. In this light, ancient myths can be seen as something akin to half-buried ruins. They are damaged, incomplete, and often surrounded by the debris of later cultural additions. But if you are willing to dig carefully, to brush away the layers of symbolism and ritual, you may just find the solid foundation of something real. And just like the science of archaeology, interpreting these narratives requires patience, cross-cultural comparison, and the willingness to look beyond the surface of the story. If we grant them this serious consideration, ancient myths could be far more than just quaint entertainment or simple moral lessons. They could be the oldest and most enduring clues we have that our history is not a single, unbroken story, but a grand, repeating cycle of worlds rising, falling, and being reborn from the ashes of memory. Not all history is written in books or carved into stone. For the vast majority of human existence, our most vital records were not inanimate objects, but living, breathing traditions. Knowledge, cultural values, and the memory of pivotal events were passed from one generation to the next through the spoken word, through meticulously memorized stories, songs, and sacred narratives. These oral histories, still practiced with profound reverence by many indigenous cultures today, are capable of carrying astonishingly accurate memories for hundreds or even thousands of years. They often take the form of what we might call myths or legends, but hidden within the poetic storytelling are often precise, verifiable details that describe real historical events. When it comes to the idea of civilizational resets, these oral traditions are particularly revealing because they speak with a haunting clarity of cataclysms, of sudden world-changing disasters that destroyed entire landscapes and ways of life. In Aboriginal Australia, a continent home to one of the world's oldest continuous cultures, oral traditions contain detailed accounts of a time when the coastline was much farther out to sea than it is today. Stories from various coastal tribes describe specific places that were once hunting grounds but are now deep underwater and speak of the ocean rising to drown the land. Modern science confirms this with stunning accuracy. At the end of the last ice age, from about 18,000 to 7,000 years ago, melting glaciers caused global sea levels to rise by nearly 400 feet, flooding vast coastal plains around Australia and the world. If these stories truly date back to that period, as some researchers believe, they would represent the oldest continuous human memories of a real, observable environmental change passed down for over 7,000 years. They are a powerful testament to the fact that even without writing, humans can record and transmit the memory of major events across immense spans of time. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Islands, many oral traditions tell of catastrophic waves that swallowed entire villages and permanently reshaped coastlines. These are not just tales of ordinary storms. They describe singular, terrifying events. In many cases, these stories align perfectly with geological evidence of prehistoric tsunamis triggered by underwater earthquakes or massive volcanic eruptions. In Hawaii, for instance, there are ancient legends of impossibly large waves arriving without warning. These legends find a chilling echo in the geological record, which shows evidence of a colossal prehistoric landslide off the coast of Oahu that would have generated a mega tsunami hundreds of feet high. The story preserved the memory of an event that science has only recently confirmed. Among the Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest, from Northern California to British Columbia, stories have been passed down for generations that speak of a great, violent shaking of the earth, followed by a towering wall of water that swept inland, devastating coastal settlements. These oral accounts match, in chilling detail, what geologists now know happened during the Cascadia earthquake of January 26, 1700. This was a massive subduction zone earthquake, estimated at a magnitude of 9.0, which also generated a powerful tsunami that struck the coast of Japan, where it was recorded in historical documents. For centuries before modern geology understood the danger, the indigenous oral traditions had already preserved a precise and accurate description of the event, a warning passed down through story. Many African oral histories speak of long civilization-breaking droughts that forced mass migrations, led to the collapse of kingdoms, and transformed entire cultures. Certain traditions from the Sahara region, for instance, tell of a distant ancestral time when the Great Desert was a lush, green paradise filled with rivers, lakes, and abundant wildlife. This is not a fantasy. Paleoclimatological evidence has shown conclusively that thousands of years ago, the Sahara was indeed a fertile savanna, before a rapid and dramatic shift in regional climate turned it into the arid desert we know today. The oral history is a surviving record of a profound environmental reset. What is so critically important about these oral histories is their unique blend of vivid physical detail and deep symbolic meaning. Over many generations of retelling, the symbolic and spiritual elements can grow, making the stories appear to be purely mythical to an outside observer. But when scientists and historians collaborate with cultural keepers to investigate the natural phenomena described, the floods, the earthquakes, the volcanic eruptions, the meteor showers, they often discover a solid bedrock of geological or archaeological evidence that supports the core events of the narrative. From the perspective of the reset hypothesis, these oral histories could be of paramount importance. If global or large-scale resets have occurred, the survivors of such events may not have possessed the means or the stability to preserve written records. Their libraries might have been burned, their cities washed away, but they could still carry the most essential record of all, the memory of what happened. They could pass this memory down to their children through story. These stories might begin as direct, harrowing eyewitness accounts. Over centuries, as the immediate trauma fades, they would naturally evolve, gaining cultural and spiritual layers to help subsequent generations make sense of the event. The core memory, however, the signal within the noise, could survive, a warning of apocalypse embedded in a sacred myth. The resilience of oral history also means that memories can survive where physical evidence has been erased. Coastal floods can scour a landscape clean of buildings and artifacts, but a story can travel inland with the survivors. Earthquakes can level cities to dust, but the memory can be retold to children and grandchildren for centuries. In some cases, oral histories may be the only surviving record of cataclysms from the distant past, events that would otherwise be completely unknown and invisible to us. Skeptics correctly point out that oral traditions are malleable and subject to change and distortion over time. And that is undeniably true. But even a distorted memory can preserve the fundamental outline of a real event, especially when that event is profoundly traumatic and unforgettable. If a great reset occurred thousands of years ago, we would expect to find its echoes in the myths and oral traditions of countless different cultures, each describing in its own unique cultural language a time when the world they knew came to a violent and sudden end. When we align these traditions from around the globe, we begin to see the ghostly outline of a shared experience. Different peoples separated by oceans and continents, all remembering great floods consuming fire, prolonged darkness, and the desperate need to begin again. Oral histories are like messages in bottles, cast into the vast ocean of time. They may be wrapped in layers of metaphor, their original details blurred by centuries of retelling, but they can still deliver a coherent and urgent message. Worlds can end. And when they do, the survivors must find a way to start over. If we dismiss these messages as mere fantasy, we risk assuming that such resets are impossible, when in fact, the stories of our ancestors may be trying to tell us that they have already happened. When you begin to connect the disparate patterns we've explored, the ghost-like traces of vanishing civilizations, the sudden and inexplicable bursts of advanced technology, a curious puzzle of repeated inventions, the resonant themes in global myths, and the hard geological evidence of past cataclysms, a larger, more cohesive picture begins to emerge. It suggests that resets in human history might not be rare, isolated accidents, but rather the defining feature of a vast, recurring process. This is the foundation of the reset cycle hypothesis, the idea that civilization does not follow a simple linear path of progress, but instead moves through a repeating pattern of rise, peak, collapse, and renewal with each full cycle, tragically erasing much of what came before. In this cyclical view, history is not a straight line moving ever upward toward our present moment. It is more like a great wheel, or perhaps a spiral. Each loop on this spiral begins with the scattered survivors of a previous collapse. Huddled in the ruins of a forgotten world, they slowly and painfully rebuild, rediscovering lost agricultural techniques, relearning basic engineering, and forming new social structures. Over many generations, societies grow more complex. Villages become cities, cities become empires. They reach a new point of high achievement in technology, art, architecture, and science. They create a stable, interconnected world. But sooner or later, a combination of internal and external pressures begins to undermine the foundations of their civilization. These threats are the great erasers we've discussed: catastrophic natural disasters, abrupt and severe climate shifts, pandemics, widespread famine, or devastating global wars. The collapse may be terrifyingly fast, like a sudden asteroid impact, or it may be a slow, grinding decline over centuries. Either way, the end result is the same: the catastrophic loss of complex infrastructure, the fragmentation of society, the decimation of the population, and most critically, the breaking of the chain of knowledge. Then, the few who remain begin the cycle anew. One of the reasons this hypothesis is so compelling is that we can clearly see smaller, regional versions of it throughout our own recorded history. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was a profound reset for Europe. The subsequent collapse of the Mayan city-states was a reset for Central America. The decline and abandonment of the great cities of the Indus Valley was a reset for that region. In each case, a period of remarkable growth and stability was followed by crisis, collapse, and a dark age where population levels plummeted and sophisticated skills and knowledge were lost, in some cases taking centuries to be fully recovered. These are local or regional examples, but they provide a working model for how such cycles could have happened on a global scale, especially in the unrecorded depths of the distant past. The reset cycle hypothesis also offers the most elegant explanation for why humanity seems to forget certain technologies and then invent them again. If each cycle ends in a collapse severe enough to wipe out the specialist classes and destroy the educational institutions and libraries, the survivors would be forced to rely on more basic essential skills. Over time, advanced techniques in metallurgy, engineering, or astronomy would be lost. Only fragments might remain, preserved imperfectly in myths, symbols, or strange, misunderstood heirlooms. Then, when conditions improve in the next cycle, a new society might rediscover these techniques, believing them to be wholly new inventions, unaware that they are simply walking a path that has been walked many times before. The length and character of each cycle could vary enormously. Some might be short, lasting only a few hundred years before succumbing to a localized disaster. Others could stretch for many thousands of years, reaching heights of achievement we can only dream of. The stability of any given cycle would depend on a civilization's resilience, its relationship with its environment, and a degree of sheer luck in avoiding multiple, overlapping catastrophes. What is truly fascinating is that many ancient cultures seem to have understood this cyclical nature of time and built it directly into their cosmology. The Hindu concept of the yugas describes a vast cycle of 4 ages, a golden age of enlightenment, followed by a progressive decline in virtue and wisdom, culminating in a dark age of conflict and ignorance, after which the cycle begins again. The Mayan long count calendar was also profoundly cyclical, marking the end and rebirth of successive world ages, or suns. The ancient Greeks, through poets like Hesiod, spoke of the ages of man golden, silver, bronze, and iron each, ending in decline and destruction before a potential renewal. These ancient beliefs may not have been purely philosophical speculations. They could have been a form of macro-history, a deep cultural memory inspired by the direct observation of past rises and falls over an immense period of time. If the reset cycle hypothesis is correct, it has 2 profound and deeply humbling implications for us. First, our current global civilization is not unique or exceptional. Others have stood where we stand now, gazing out at their complex, interconnected world, believing their achievements were permanent and their progress would last forever. They were wrong. Second, we may be profoundly underestimating both the age and the complexity of the human story. Instead of a single 200,000-year arc from primitive hunter-gatherer to advanced technologist, we might be living in just the latest of many high points, each one built upon the invisible ruins and fragmented memories of those that came before. This idea can be deeply unsettling because it shatters the comforting modern illusion of permanence and continuous progress. But it can also be empowering. If we understand that we are in a cycle, we might be able to identify the signs of instability and take steps to mitigate them. We could, for instance, create systems designed to preserve our most essential knowledge and technology in a way that could survive a global collapse, a kind of civilizational seed bank, ensuring that the next cycle begins with more than just myths and broken stones. For now, the reset cycle hypothesis remains a theory, one that sits on the fringes of mainstream historical and archaeological thought. But the clues are there, scattered in forgotten ruins, encoded in ancient myths, and written in the geological strata of the Earth itself. Whether or not we choose to accept the idea in its entirety, it forces us to ask a different and more humble set of questions about our place in time. We are not simply standing at the end of a long road leading from a primitive past to a glorious future. We may be in the middle of a great, looping journey, one that has turned many times before, and, unless we learn its lessons, will surely turn again. When we imagine the collapse of a civilization, our minds tend to conjure images of physical decay, of crumbling skyscrapers choked with vines, and of scattered, desperate survivors. But what is harder to visualize, and perhaps far more significant, is the invisible collapse, the astonishing speed with which collective knowledge can disappear when the systems they create, protect, and transmit it are gone. If history has been reset multiple times, then the sheer velocity at which a complex society can forget everything it has achieved is the key to understanding why these earlier worlds left so few definitive traces behind. Most of us operate under the assumption that knowledge, once discovered, is permanent. But in reality, it is an incredibly fragile ecosystem. Knowledge does not exist in the abstract. It lives in the trained minds of living people, in the functionality of our tools, in the pages of our books, and in the servers that power our digital world. All of these vessels are mortal. If our modern world were to suffer a true systemic collapse today, say, from a global event that destroyed the electrical grid, we would lose the vast majority of our accessible information almost instantly. The internet would go dark. Digital records, without power and maintenance, would begin to degrade and would be largely unreadable within decades. Without functioning cities and institutions, our libraries and archives would succumb to fire, flood, and decay. The chain of understanding would be catastrophically broken. The stark truth is that the overwhelming majority of people in our society do not understand how the systems they depend upon for survival actually work. We use smartphones with casual ease, but only a tiny fraction of 1% of the population could build one from raw materials, or even repair one without specialized tools. We drive cars, but few among us could forge an engine block or refine gasoline. Even things we consider basic necessities, purifying water on a mass scale, manufacturing antibiotics, generating electricity, are highly complex skills concentrated in a very small number of specialized fields. In a collapse scenario where those specialists are lost, their knowledge effectively vanishes with them. History provides us with chilling, small-scale examples of this process. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe lost access to technologies and knowledge that had been commonplace for centuries. The formula for the remarkably durable Roman concrete was forgotten for over 1,000 years. The engineering principles behind their aqueducts, their systems of central heating, and their advanced plumbing became lost arts. It wasn't until the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution that similar levels of technical skill were rediscovered. We can also see this in the archaeological record of isolated communities. There are known cases of island populations that once possessed skills like pottery making or the use of metal tools, but later reverted to using more primitive stone or wood implements after being cut off from trade networks. They didn't stop using the advanced technology because it was inferior. They stopped because they no longer possessed the specialized knowledge or resources to produce it. The rate at which a society forgets is directly proportional to the complexity of its knowledge and how widely that knowledge is distributed. Everyday skills like basic farming, fishing, or building a simple shelter are more likely to survive a collapse because they are practiced by a large portion of the population. But advanced scientific, medical, and engineering knowledge is exquisitely vulnerable. If only a few thousand people in the world truly understand how to operate a nuclear reactor or fabricate a microchip, and a catastrophe eliminates that small group, those skills are effectively extinct. The environment itself becomes an accelerant of forgetting. In warm, humid climates, paper, cloth, and wood rot with astonishing speed. In deserts, shifting sands can bury entire cities. In jungles, the relentless pressure of plant life can reclaim and pulverize the grandest of buildings within decades. If you were to simply leave a modern city like New York or London completely unattended, within 500 years, it would be an almost unrecognizable ruin. In 5,000 years, it could be little more than a few anomalous bumps on the landscape, its story told only by a strange concentration of plastics and metals in the soil layer. Without written records, the only way to preserve complex information is through oral tradition. But as we've seen, oral tradition is a leaky vessel. Over time, precise, technical details fade. Events become exaggerated and mythologized. Practical instructions are transformed into symbolic stories. A literal, technical description of a machine might, over centuries, turn into a legend about a magical, self-propelled chariot. A historical memory of a great flood becomes a myth about the gods punishing humanity for their hubris. The kernel of truth might still be there, but it is buried under so many layers of interpretation that it is no longer recognizable as a factual account. This is why a full reset is so devastatingly effective at erasing the past. Once the generation that understands the old world is gone, the survivors must rebuild based on what they can remember and what is immediately useful for survival. Everything else is forgotten. Let's imagine this process in our own world. Within a generation, 25 years, after a collapse, the living memory of how our complex systems worked would be gone. The children of the survivors would grow up in a world without electricity or the internet, viewing the remnants of our technology as the mysterious artifacts of a lost, magical age. Within a few centuries, 200 to 500 years, the physical world we built would be largely reclaimed by nature. Our languages would have drifted and changed so much that our books, if they survived, would be difficult to decipher. The old world would be a legend, a time of giants who built the crumbling towers that dot the landscape. Within a few millennia, 2,000 to 5,000 years, almost all but the most massive stone and concrete structures would be gone, buried, or eroded. The story of our civilization would be nothing more than a few scattered myths, their origins completely forgotten. The most unsettling part is not just that this forgetting happens, but how terrifyingly fast it could happen to us. If our global infrastructure collapsed today, within 50 years, most of our advanced technology would be inoperable junk. Within 100 years, it would be almost impossible to recreate it from scratch without the entire global manufacturing and resource extraction base that supports it. Within 500 years, future inhabitants of our world might gaze upon the eroded foundations of a skyscraper, the same way we gaze upon the pyramids as mysterious and monumental structures whose builders are half-forgotten gods or kings. Understanding how quickly and completely a civilization can forget everything forces us to look at the historical record, or the lack thereof, in a new light. The fact that we do not find clear evidence of advanced technology in the deep past does not necessarily mean it never existed. It might simply mean that it vanished before it could leave enough durable traces for us to find. The materials decayed, the records were destroyed, and the knowledge was forgotten before it could be passed on. If resets have occurred, then this process of forgetting is not just a side effect of the collapse. It is the very mechanism of the reset itself. The speed at which civilizations can lose their memory means that even the greatest of worlds can vanish almost completely, leaving the future to wonder if they were ever anything more than the dream. It is a tempting and deeply comforting thought to believe that our modern world has somehow transcended the cycles of the past. We have skyscrapers that pierce the clouds, airplanes that compress oceans into hours, and a digital network that connects the minds of billions in an instant. We imagine that once a civilization reaches this level of technological complexity, it becomes too robust, too knowledgeable, and too powerful to collapse in the way ancient societies did. But when you look beneath the glittering surface of our achievements and examine the intricate systems that hold our world together, a different and more disturbing picture emerges. Our modern global civilization is not a fortress of permanence. It is a delicate and exquisitely complex house of cards. If history has indeed been reset before, we may be, in some crucial ways, far more vulnerable to a reset than any civilization that has come before us. The reason for this profound vulnerability is, in its essence, remarkably simple. Our modern world is not a single, robust entity. It is a delicate ecosystem of deeply interconnected and interdependent systems. And these systems, like climbers roped together on a treacherous mountain face, depend utterly on each other for survival. Our global food supply is entirely dependent on complex transportation networks. That transportation is dependent on a constant supply of fuel. Fuel production is dependent on a functioning electrical grid, and the electrical grid is dependent on a vast, intricate industrial and digital base. If one of these critical layers fails with sufficient severity, it can trigger a catastrophic chain reaction, a cascade of collapse that brings all the other layers down with it. This intricate interconnectedness is what makes our civilization so powerful and efficient in times of stability, but so dangerously brittle in a crisis. Consider for a moment how terrifyingly fast our daily reality can unravel when just one link in that chain breaks. In most major cities around the world, the average grocery store carries only about 3 days' worth of food on its shelves. We live in a constant, flowing river of supply, and we have forgotten how small the reservoir is. If the trucks that replenish those stores were to stop arriving, the shelves would be stripped bare in less than a week. If the power grid were to go down, all refrigerated and frozen goods would spoil. Without the electricity to run water treatment plants, clean, potable water would cease to flow from our taps. In the dense, crowded environments of our cities, disease would spread with terrifying speed. These are not slow, creeping processes that unfold over generations. In our modern world, the descent from order to chaos can happen in a matter of days. Our near-total reliance on digital technology makes us even more exposed. Finance, communication, global trade, healthcare, logistics, nearly every facet of our existence is mediated by computer systems that are vulnerable to disruption from solar flares, cyber attacks, or simple, cascading hardware failures. If the internet and its supporting infrastructure were to go down globally for even a few weeks, the effects would be apocalyptic. The global financial system, which exists almost entirely as digital data, would cease to exist. Supply chains, managed by complex logistics software, would freeze solid. Critical services, from hospitals to emergency responders, would collapse under the weight of an information blackout. We have also engineered fragility into our economy through the doctrine of just-in-time manufacturing. In this hyper-efficient system, parts and materials arrive at factories precisely when they are needed for assembly, with minimal inventory kept in storage. This brilliant strategy keeps costs low and profits high, but it also means that our entire global industrial capacity has almost no buffer, no shock absorbers. A single major disaster, a natural catastrophe, a geopolitical conflict, a pandemic can sever a key supply line, halting production in critical industries and sending crippling shockwaves rippling through the entire global economy. In some fundamental ways, ancient civilizations were far more resilient. They were, by necessity, more localized and self-sufficient. They relied on local resources, grew much of their own food, and their societies could often survive significant disruptions to long-distance trade or communication. A crop failure in Egypt did not cause a famine in Gaul. Our globally interconnected world, by contrast, gives us incredible capabilities and a shared prosperity. But it also means that we are all tied to the same delicate web. If that web tears, everyone, everywhere, feels the tremor. There is also the critical problem of hyperspecialization. In the modern world, the vast majority of the population works in highly specific narrow fields. This is the source of our efficiency, but in a collapse, it would be our undoing. Very few individuals possess the broad, practical survival skills needed to rebuild a society from scratch. In earlier ages, a much larger percentage of the population knew how to farm, how to hunt, how to build a shelter, how to preserve food, and how to make basic tools. Today, if our complex systems failed, the overwhelming majority of people would be forced to relearn these foundational skills from zero, all while under the extreme duress of a survival situation. This inherent fragility doesn't mean that a collapse is inevitable, but it does mean we are living within a system that could, under the right combination of pressures, fail catastrophically and with breathtaking speed. And if historical resets have happened before, this could be exactly how they began, with a civilization so interconnected, so complex, and so specialized that a single powerful shock cascaded through the entire structure, leading to a complete and irreversible breakdown. Thinking about the fragility of our modern world forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. Our current period of relative stability and technological wonder might be the exception, not the rule. If the reset cycle hypothesis is correct, we could be living near the very peak of our own cycle, blissfully unaware of how close we are to the edge of the precipice. The lesson is not to succumb to fear, but to cultivate a profound sense of humility and recognition of our vulnerability. Civilizations, it seems, often fall not because they are weak in every way, but because they become overwhelmingly strong in ways that make them rigid and inflexible. And when something that rigid finally breaks, it does not bend. It shatters completely. Of all the possible triggers for a modern-day reset, perhaps the most plausible, and the one capable of acting with the most terrifying speed, is a sudden, global digital blackout. We have constructed a civilization where nearly every vital function is inextricably tied to digital systems. Banking and finance, transportation and logistics, healthcare and communication, energy grids and water supplies, all of it depends on the silent, invisible dance of data through computer networks. If you were to simply switch that system off, the modern world would not just slow down or regress. For all practical purposes, it would cease to exist. A global digital blackout could be initiated in several ways. A massive solar storm, a coronal mass ejection on the scale of the 1859 Carrington event, could send a wave of charged particles slamming into Earth's magnetic field. This could induce powerful electrical currents that would fry the transformers of our power grids, destroy sensitive satellite electronics, and render the entire infrastructure of our digital age useless. In 1859, this event merely caused telegraph systems to spark and fail. Today, it would be a civilization-ending event. Another terrifying possibility is a large-scale, coordinated cyber attack, a digital world war where state or non-state actors simultaneously disable or corrupt the critical operating systems of multiple nations. Finally, there is the simple, mundane threat of a cascading failure, a single, critical software bug or hardware failure in one key system that triggers a chain reaction of shutdowns that spreads uncontrollably across the globe. However it happens, the effect would be immediate, total, and profoundly disorienting. In the first few hours, there would be an eerie silence. Phones would go dead. The constant hum of the internet would cease. ATMs and credit card systems would stop working, instantly rendering most forms of money useless. Air traffic control would lose contact with planes in the sky. Stock markets, the digital heart of our economy, would freeze in mid-trade. Hospitals, suddenly cut off from digital medical records and automated supply chains, would be thrown into chaos. The disruption would be felt in every home, in every business, on every street corner, all at once. In the first few days, a fragile sense of normalcy might hold. Many people would assume it's a temporary, albeit severe, power outage. They would wait for the lights and the internet to flicker back on, making do with whatever food and cash they have on hand. But as the silent hours stretch into silent days, the true nature of the crisis would begin to dawn. Supermarkets, unable to be restocked by a paralyzed supply chain, would be emptied by panicked crowds. Without refrigeration, all perishable food would spoil. Gas stations, their pumps inoperable without electricity, would run dry. In the cities, a sense of confinement would turn to desperation. People would begin looking for ways to leave, creating gridlock on roads that were no longer managed by traffic systems. Money would become a central and immediate problem. With banks offline, there would be no way to access savings, receive payments, or transfer funds. In a world where the vast majority of economic activity is purely digital, the loss of electronic payment systems would bring commerce to a complete and total standstill. Some communities might revert to barter or use whatever physical currency is available, but these would be chaotic, inefficient, and unreliable systems, incapable of supporting a complex society. The blackout would also be a communication catastrophe. Without the internet, television, or cell networks, news would travel at the speed of rumor. People would have no way of knowing if the outage was local, national, or global. They wouldn't know if it was caused by a solar flare, a terrorist attack, or a simple technical failure. This profound uncertainty would be a breeding ground for fear, paranoia, and misinformation, making any kind of coordinated, rational response almost impossible. Critical infrastructure would begin to fail catastrophically. Water treatment plants and pumping stations, which rely on electricity and digital controls, would shut down. Within days, clean running water would become a scarce and precious resource in many urban areas. Hospitals, operating on limited backup generators, would be overwhelmed. Once their fuel ran out, they would be reduced to 19th century levels of care. Emergency services would themselves become victims of the collapse, facing crippling shortages of equipment, fuel, and personnel. If the digital blackout were to last for weeks, the damage to the fabric of our civilization would become irreversible. Factories and distribution centers, cut off from supplies and communication, would shut down permanently. Our highly optimized agricultural systems, which depend on diesel-powered machinery, GPS guidance, chemical fertilizers, and global trade, would falter and then fail, leading to widespread famine. Governments, unable to communicate with their populations or coordinate relief efforts, would lose their authority, and in many places, might collapse entirely. In the ensuing power vacuum, law enforcement could be stretched too thin to maintain order, leading to terrifying spikes in crime and violent conflict. Within a year of a sustained global digital blackout, the world could be unrecognizable. The great, glittering cities might be largely abandoned, rendered unlivable by the lack of resources. The population would be scattered, migrating in a desperate search for food, fresh water, and safety. Communities would become profoundly isolated, forced to rely on whatever local production they could manage. The vast majority of our modern technology would be useless inert metal and plastic junk without the complex ecosystem of power and information that once gave it life. From the perspective of a historical reset, this scenario is so potent because it does not require the total physical destruction of the world. It only requires the breakdown of the invisible systems that hold our civilization together. The knowledge of how to rebuild those systems might still exist in printed books or in the memories of surviving experts. But without a functioning industrial base, without global communication, and without organized supply chains, that knowledge would be almost impossible to put back into action. The process of generational forgetting would begin with shocking speed. The first generation born after the blackout would grow up in a much simpler, harsher, and more dangerous reality. They would listen to their parents' stories of the old world with a mixture of awe and disbelief. To them, advanced technology would be a relic, something their elders spoke of with a sad nostalgia, like a fairy tale. Within just a few generations, the time of the glowing screens and flying metal birds might be remembered only in distorted myths and legends, stripped of all technical detail. This is a plausible model for how earlier resets could have played out. The specific cause might have been different: a volcanic winter, a comet impact, a global pandemic, but the effect on a complex civilization would be the same. The intricate systems that sustain it collapse, and the survivors are unable to reboot them in time. Over the generations, the memory fades, leaving only enigmatic ruins and perplexing stories for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The digital blackout scenario is a chilling reminder of how quickly we could lose our own place in history. We like to think of our age as the pinnacle of permanence, but in truth, it is balanced on a knife's edge. The very complexity that makes our civilization so powerful is the source of its most profound fragility. And if history has indeed been reset before, a silent, instantaneous shutdown of our digital world may be one of the easiest and fastest ways for it to happen all over again. When a complex civilization collapses, the immediate and desperate focus for the survivors is, of course, survival. The struggle for food, shelter, and basic safety eclipses all other concerns. The great libraries, the digital archives, and the historical records of the old world, if they survive the initial cataclysm at all, are usually scattered, damaged, or completely inaccessible. Over the long and difficult decades that follow, as new, simpler societies begin to form from the ashes, a strange and inevitable process unfolds. The past is not just forgotten, it is actively rewritten. The way people remember history after a major reset is rarely, if ever, the same as the way it actually happened. This rewriting is not always a conscious act of deception. In the early stages, in the first few generations after a collapse, stories of the time before are told by the few who still remember it. These accounts might be accurate at first, filled with the raw details of a lost world. But human memory is fallible, and with each retelling, the story changes. Details are simplified. Timelines are compressed. The narrative is shaped to fit a moral lesson. Over generations, the stories become more exaggerated, more symbolic, and are slowly merged with local folklore and religious beliefs. Events that were once historical and technological begin to sound mythical and magical. The memory of an airplane becomes the legend of a flying chariot. The ruins of a skyscraper become the abandoned palace of a giant. What began as a memory inexorably transforms into a myth. In some cases, however, the rewriting of history is entirely intentional. As new leaders, warlords, or cultures rise to power in the post-reset world, they have a vested interest in reshaping the story of the past to legitimize their own authority. They might portray the old, fallen civilization as decadent, corrupt, or divinely doomed, framing their own rise as a necessary purification or a righteous new beginning. They may systematically destroy or alter any surviving records books, inscriptions, artifacts that contradict their preferred narrative. This is not a uniquely ancient phenomenon. Even in our modern era, we have seen totalitarian regimes attempt to manipulate history to suit their political needs. Religious and spiritual transformation often plays a central role in rewriting the past after a reset. When a new belief system emerges and becomes dominant, it naturally reinterprets past events through its own theological lens. A catastrophic asteroid impact is no longer remembered as a random cosmic event, but as a divine punishment for the sins of the ancestors. The technological wonders of the previous age are no longer seen as the products of science and engineering, but are attributed to the miraculous powers of gods, angels, or supernatural beings. Over time, These spiritual interpretations become the official, orthodox version of events, completely replacing any practical or scientific explanation that might have once existed. Sometimes, the rewriting happens simply because the survivors and their descendants cannot possibly comprehend the technology or the social structures of the old world. Imagine a small, non-industrial society thousands of years in our future, stumbling upon the ruins of a modern international airport. Lacking any concept of aeronautical engineering, they would struggle to understand what they were seeing. They might logically conclude that the vast, crumbling structures were temples built for religious ceremonies. The decaying hulks of airplanes in the hangars could be plausibly interpreted as the effigies of giant, metallic birds or mythical sky creatures. In the profound absence of context, people will always fill in the gaps with the most familiar and logical ideas they have. And over time, those ideas harden into what is accepted as history. This process could elegantly explain why so many of our own world's ancient ruins are surrounded by myths of gods, giants, or supernatural builders. If one or more advanced civilizations existed in the deep past and then collapsed, their surviving remnants would have been an insoluble puzzle to the less advanced peoples who came after. With no way to replicate the technology that built the megalithic structures or carved the precision artifacts, they would explain them in the only terms they knew: religion, legend, and magic. Over the long stretches of time between resets, this rewritten history becomes the only history. The real events of the previous cycle fade beyond all hope of recovery. The myths and legends solidify into cultural truth, taught to each new generation as indisputable fact. Without surviving intelligible records or overwhelming physical evidence to the contrary, there is no way to challenge the established story. And so, that story becomes the foundation upon which the new world builds its entire understanding of itself. The reset cycle hypothesis suggests that this process of forgetting and rewriting may have happened multiple times. Each cycle would bequeath to the next only the most fragmented and distorted version of its truth. If we are living in such a cycle now, it is entirely possible that some of what we hold to be our most ancient history is itself a rewritten, mythologized version of something far older and stranger. What we think of as the dawn of civilization might, in fact, be nothing more than the beginning of the most recent chapter, the first page written after the last great library was burned. This idea is profoundly unsettling because it means that even our most rigorous historical reconstructions could be built upon layers of altered memory and foundational fictions. Archaeology can unearth the artifacts, but it cannot always tell us the true story behind them with certainty. After a reset, rewriting is inevitable. Human beings are, at our core, meaning-making creatures. We cannot tolerate a vacuum in our understanding, so we fill the gaps in our knowledge with whatever stories make the most sense to us at the time. But with each retelling, with each new layer of interpretation, we drift a little further from what really happened. Over centuries and millennia, that drift can become so great that the original truth is no longer visible at all. We may be living in a world built upon the ruins of forgotten empires, but our maps of history have been drawn over countless layers of these lost and rewritten realities. And the strangest part of all is the realization that if another reset happens in our future, our own story, our art, our science, our triumphs, and our follies will be subjected to the very same process. And the people of the next age will wonder about the myths of a lost civilization that had magical glowing screens, towers that touched the heavens, and lights that shone brightly without any fire. If history has indeed been reset before, then we are, all of us, living on borrowed chapters. Everything we know, everything we have built, our gleaming cities, our profound science, our intricate global culture, rests upon a foundation that is far less permanent than we allow ourselves to believe. Civilizations rise with an intoxicating confidence, certain that their story is the final story, that their achievements will last forever. But the deep, silent record of the earth itself suggests otherwise. Over and over again, through ice and fire, through the rising of the seas and the shaking of the ground, the planet has reminded all forms of life that nothing is immune to the relentless forces of change. When we imagine the past, we instinctively see a single straight line, an unbroken thread that begins in the distant mists of prehistory and leads inevitably and logically to us. But if resets have happened, that line is an illusion. The real timeline of intelligent life on this planet is broken, patched together from salvaged fragments, and filled with vast, silent gaps that we cannot see. Somewhere in those unrecorded gaps could lie entire histories, each with their own triumphs, their own struggles, and their own final, silent endings. They, too, may have believed that their time was the ultimate one, the culmination of all that had come before, just as we so often do now. And yet, they are gone. The most sobering thought of all is that a planetary reset does not require anything supernatural or wildly far-fetched. Nature can do it with ease. A single sufficiently large asteroid, a massive supervolcanic eruption, or an abrupt, catastrophic climate shift could strip away the complex support systems of our world in a matter of years. And humanity itself, for the first time in its history, now possesses the power to do it. A full-scale nuclear exchange, the collapse of our fragile global systems, or a technological overreach with unforeseen consequences could trigger our own reset. Even without a total extinction event, enough damage could be done to push us back into a simpler, more fractured existence, leaving only scattered traces for the next version of civilization to puzzle over. If that were to happen, our digital records, our vast infrastructure, and even our most monumental creations might not survive the long, patient reach of time. In a few thousand years, the memory of our entire global civilization could be reduced to a handful of strange, indestructible artifacts and a collection of distorted stories, passed down in ways we cannot possibly control. The people of that distant future might look back at our time the way we look back at Atlantis, half believing, half doubting that such a world could have ever truly existed. And so, the ultimate question is not just whether history has been reset more than once, but whether we are currently living in a world that will be reset again. Perhaps the pattern is a fundamental, inescapable part of life on a dynamic planet, a great cosmic cycle of growth, collapse, and renewal that repeats across the ages. If that is true, then our role may not be to somehow escape the cycle, but to live within it as wisely and as fully as we can, knowing with certainty that our time, like all the times that have come before, will one day end. Maybe the real profound lesson in this entire unsettling idea is one of humility. We are not the first, and we will not be the last. Our age, for all of its dazzling achievements and profound insights, is but one layer among many destined to one day fade and become part of the geological and mythological strata of the earth, just like all the ones that came before it. And one day far, far into the future, another people may stand where we stand now, gazing up at the same silent stars, and wonder as we do, just how many times the story of this world has been told erased and told all over again.